It's your job if you can corral them this morning.
I got to corral them all in. All right. So before we start the day and move into our first agenda item, I wanted to say thank you once again to Kelly and her crew for the great tour yesterday. Perfect.
How about some Morse code?
Good Morse code, Will. Yeah. So before we get started today, I wanted to thank Kelly and her crew yesterday for the wonderful tour and reception. I think it was just great to get out there and have a good conversation about the project here in the Lower Rogue Estuary. Also, last night we had a great opportunity as a board to kind of say our farewells and do a slight roast of Laura Masterson. And I just wanted to say thank you once again, Laura, for all of your service on the board and your contributions over the last couple of years, 2.5 years. So thank you once again, Laura.
Laura, it seems like a lot more than 2.5 years, but I mean that in a very good way.
In a good way.
You seem like an institution that ought to stay.
So with that, we'll go ahead and get started today. We're going to move to agenda item J on the morning agenda, the spending plan, and Maida will be presenting that.
Good morning, Maida Lofsgarden, Executive Director. Because we, well, let me ask a question. How many of you have been on board for more than 2 years on this board? Okay, because of that, we are going to be spending some extra time in the spending plan this morning. For those of you who we've done onboarding with over the last year or so, we've walked through the concept of the spending plan with you, but this is our first touch at it during this biennium. So if you look at it, agenda item M, I'm going to just point you to a couple of things I'm going to be using as we talk through this morning. So one is I'll walk through the background and how our process works, and that's in the staff report itself. Attachment A is the actual spending plan. So we'll be spending a little bit of time talking through the spending plan and how it's organized. Attachment B, the only relevant part that we're going to be talking about today under OWEB strategic direction and principles is at the bottom of that first page, it talks about focus investments and that the board wants to continue focused investments with a gradual increase over time. And I'm going to come back to why that matters in a minute, because that was a direction that you guys need to decide today if you want to continue. Attachment C is the graph that you have in front of you, and I'll be talking about that in a little while. And then the very last, no, I think that's it. The other thing that I want you to keep in mind, and you have a copy of it, is our new strategic plan. And we'll be talking about why that matters in a little while. So the things you'll be using in your conversation this morning, again, are the strategic plan, the long-term investment strategy, this chart in front of you, and the spending plan itself. So as I've talked with folks when we've been going through the onboarding, the spending plan is your single largest funding decision when we get to that point. And the reason is, if you go back to the chart that we developed at Alan's request that I provided to you yesterday, there are in total around 17 different grant programs that we offer. Your spending plan tells us as a staff how much money we're going to put into each of those. And so that then drives, when Eric comes to you with open solicitation grants, the cap that he's operating under. So while when you approve the spending plan, you're not approving individual grants, you are telling us as a staff, hey, we don't want you spending any more money than this. Now, the nice thing about the spending plan, and those of you who haven't been on board will see this in the future, is we often have what we call recapture dollars, which are grants that were expended underneath their dollar amount. So a $300,000 grant ended up spending $250,000. We capture that money back, and potential increases excuse me, that come from the legislature. So we can flex that spending plan through the biennium, and we do. We do an update every year of the spending plan. There are times, and we did this with acquisitions last year, where we will come to you and say, ask your permission to spend more than what you've proposed because we think we've got a slate of grants, but those are all decisions that you're making around this plan that you're going to approve next July. So because of that, we spend the October meeting, the January meeting, the April meeting, and the July meeting with a large focus on the spending plan. What we try to do at each meeting is just walk you a little further down the path until we get to the decision point. So now, at this meeting, all we're going to be talking about is the overall timeline. We're going to talk about the connection between the spending plan, the 2013 investment strategy, the current strategic plan, and we are not going to have you vote on anything today, but we need your help to start to establish an initial direction for how you want to have us proceeding. The reason that piece matters now, last biennium we started the Focus Investment Partnership Program, and it's going to sound like I'm jumping around a little bit, but there's a reason. Last biennium, we started the Focus Investment Partnership Program. We did not approve those partnership funding until the beginning of the biennium. So you were approving the spending plan the same time that you were approving the Focus Investment Partnerships. We found that to be really clunky because then we're 6 months into the biennium before those FIPs actually start operating. And so what we've done is back shifted. So you are actually going to be approving FIPs 6 months before you approve a spending plan. Because of that, we need to get an early indication from you of what percentage of the spending plan you want to spend on focus investments. You're not making a final decision at this point in time, but what you're going to be doing is telling the Focus Investment Partnership Committee kind of operate within this range when you're looking at these applications. So with that in mind, I'm going to walk you through the components of the spending plan and just give you a high-level overview. I want to answer any questions that you have, and then we'll talk about this FIP percentage piece. Before I go further, those of you who have been on board for more than 2 years, is there any additional information you think would be important for the newer board members to understand before we move into this conversation? Okay, they are leaving you just high and dry on this. So, first we'll look at attachment A. When you see the spending plan, and that's this document that's a very detailed spreadsheet, when you look at this spending plan, you see that it's actually broken up into a set of categories. The first category is open solicitation. The second is focus investments. These are kind of big chunked out categories. Operating capacity, other, and then down below are other distributed funds. Starting with the other distributed funds, those are funds that just come into you. You as a board need to sign off that they go to different agencies. But other than that, it's largely either delegated from the legislature or from the governor's office or from some other source. So those funds, at the beginning of the year, we're just going to ask you to transfer those funds out. And they're typically Department of Forestry funds, Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery funds, Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission funds. So those are funds really that you're in charge of, but they tend to go out for specifically identified projects. The next category up, and we'll probably do some shifting of this in the next biennium, the next category up is other. And these are grants that either were testing something new or they just largely didn't really fit the traditional long-term investment strategy categories. So those are things like the governor's priorities, which is in coordination with the governor's office. What are the initiatives we want to be working on in partnership with them? The CREP program, which we have a mandated match for. So anytime Farm Service Agency does a contract, we are required to match it. So you don't really have direct control over that other than saying we want to run the program or we don't. Above that then is operating capacity. These are the capacity grants that go to watershed councils and soil and water conservation districts. This is an area that in the long-term investment strategy in the past you have said you want to continue. We will go into more detail about these programs later, but those funds are equally distributed between the watershed councils in the state get half of the money and the soil and water conservation districts in the state get half of the money. Also our statewide organization partnership support that you're going to hear about later this morning, and then the collaboration grants, which is where we're helping entities that want to do some kind of combination to strengthen their services. Above that are focused investments. These are the ones that the board will be looking at and approving in January. Right now we have 6 focused investment implementation partnerships. We have funding for development for FIPS, and then we have effectiveness monitoring. And then last above that is the open solicitation category, which is where the vast majority of your funding goes. There are a series of grants, but they are all categorized under this open solicitation category. So I'm going to stop again and see if you guys have any questions. And by the way, in April, we actually go in detail through every single grant. So we're not going to do that today because we spend a day with you where we have staff who are running every single one of those programs walk through them with you, but this is just the structure. So I saw Liza Jane.
Liza Jane, Will.
Not me, but
Will,
Stephen.
Steve.
Okay.
Liza Jane McAllister. Just a quick question on the others where they're kind of a pass-through. Who's accountable for those dollars to see that they're spent where they're supposed to be spent?
Yeah, great question for the record. Maida Lofsgarden, it depends. So with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, they receive a portion of the Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Funds. That's a part of our grant that we submit. They as an agency are responsible, so this they spend this on, for example, their monitoring programs is the largest percentage. We also continue as a staff to have oversight, so Renee is our point of contact, and we have to report back to PCSRF. Renee is responsible for that, and she coordinates that with that agency. The Forest Collaboratives, that is funding that comes from the Department of Forestry. In that case, we are running a grant program on their behalf with their funding, so we do that in coordination with them. Courtney Schaff leads that effort, and they're actually keeping their eyes on us to make sure that the funding that they provide us is being managed in the way that they expected those grants to be managed. So it's a mix in that category.
Stephen and then Alan.
Steve here. Once you have a spending plan approved by the board, how much flexibility do you have in each of the items on there before you have to come back to the board to get approval?
Great question for the record, Maida Lofsgarden. You're going to see this later today, actually, in the governor's priorities. We cannot go above the spending plan without coming back to you. We can operate below it. So, for example, in the past, in the small grants program, we have had instances where we have not fully spent that amount. That's fine, and we report to you and we tell you that, but we cannot go above the spending plan without requesting your permission.
Alan, then Gary.
Alan Henning. Maida?
Clock or something. I just realized I don't have a way to track my time. Could I borrow something? Yes, go ahead, sorry. I just want to make sure I'm keeping us on time.
Right here.
I'll just click it open. Perfect, thanks. Okay.
There's 2 other categories?
Yes, there are 2 other categories.
And could you provide more on the one above the lowest one?
Yes, and
Liza Jane was asking about?
she was talking about the other distributed
She was
funds.
talking about both.
Oh, talking about both. Oh, yes, absolutely.
Thanks.
So in the other funds, these are areas where you all delegate the authority for us. So in that category, we are in charge of making sure that they run appropriately. However, for example, the CREP program doesn't really, we didn't feel like it really fit open solicitation because it's farmers, it's a very different program. Farmers are signing up with a farm service agency. We don't pick those grants. Farm Service Agency does, and it's on a first come, first served basis. If they are eligible, they are signed up, and we are required to match it. And so it didn't feel like that's a response. It's not an open solicitation grant. So we put it here just because the small set of things, we couldn't figure out where else to put them. The same thing with the governor's priorities. It's not an open solicitation. You may say it's a focused investment. We've wiggled around with whether that would be where we would put it, but it's for things like the sage-grouse conservation work that we're doing at the strategic level, coordinating with other agencies. So similar to like what you were doing with the Columbia Basin, we're paying for a lot of that type of work that then leads to restoration, but it's a ways out. And so it felt more like that it didn't hang in any of the other places. So that's the issue. In those cases, we manage all of that money. We just couldn't, it didn't feel like it plugged into other categories. We may decide when we get to next April and we talk through those, you guys might say, nah, put this one up in open solicitation, but it's more a awkwardness of the types of grants that are there.
Okay, we had Gary, and then we should move forward with the conversation.
Gary,
Sorry.
Maida, can you remind me what item number, or line item 29 and 30, the difference between the statewide organizational partnership
Yep.
and the organizational collaborative grants?
Yeah, so the statewide organizational partnership support is the funding that you'll hear about it shortly, so I'm not going to go into detail. We have a whole agenda item, is the support that goes to the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts, the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils, the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts, and OCEAN, which has changed what it stands for, so I'm going to call it OCEAN. So that is the statewide organizations whose members are our grantees. So they provide a lot of technical training and things like that. Again, you'll hear about that shortly. The organizational collaborative grants, we've had a small set of them in the state. This is a small set of funding for organizations who are interested in finding out how they can work better together. So in the Rogue, there was a merger of the watershed councils and the Rogue. There's the fiscal services, I think that Meg, you asked about yesterday, Cascade Pacific RC&D. We actually gave them a grant to figure out how to serve as a fiscal sponsor for other organizations. So these are grants that help shared service models across the state. All right. Excuse me. So moving along in this process, in April, we will go through every one of these line items in detail. You'll have a chance to ask questions. We will talk about how much we're proposing is in the spending plan for that. In January, we're going to ask you how much you want to put largely into these categories. So that's the time that we spend in January, and then based on that, then we come back to you in April and say, okay, if that's how you want to spend, and this is what the legislature is saying the money that's available is, this is how we would propose to you that we divide that funding up. We have a big dialogue about that in April, and then in July, we come back with any changes you had, and you approve of a final spending plan for the year. Again, because of this funkiness where we really want to move the FIP applications forward, we're not asking them to be first in line. We're not saying that every FIP that the committee likes gets approved, but you need to give the committee a sense of what range they should be operating in. So if you look at the attachment B, again, where I referenced the long-term investment strategy, and so another question, how many of you were here in 2013? Will? Alan? Debbie, who's not here? So in 2013, the board approved a long-term investment strategy. This was the connection between our strategic plan and our granting. It was the board recognizing that you operate with an investment portfolio. And what do you want that portfolio to look like? This is how we got those categories that you see in the spending plan on the page before. So we said these are the things that are important to us. In only one case did the board provide a direction. What they said is that they want to continue operating capacity and open solicitation. They also said that we want monitoring across all program areas. So that's why we see the monitoring conversation around capacity that we had yesterday. Monitoring around open solicitation grants, monitoring around FIPS. It sits in all of those areas. And the board said that they would like to continue focused investments with a gradual increase over time. The reason was at that point in time that it was a brand new program. We'd only had 2 test cases in the Willamette, actually 3, Willamette, Deschutes, and Klamath. We were just entering formally into this process, and so the board wanted to start at a level, but they wanted to very much indicate their feeling to future boards that they thought this was an area that we should grow into over time, which means then you've got to ultimately take a look at these other areas and see where you want to move with your funding. Generally, and Alan actually raised this as a question yesterday, generally grants that are in the focus investment category, except for the development ones, our restoration grants and acquisition grants, right? That's what we're paying for. We're paying in the Grand Rond. We are paying for projects. Those projects were previously, in many cases, coming through open solicitation. So I say that because that's a lot where the balancing act takes place, right? We're funding restoration grants through focus investments. We're funding restoration grants through open solicitation. We're funding technical assistance grants through open solicitation, through focus investments, acquisition grants in both places. So if you're going to see a gradual increase over time in focus investments, probably the place you're going to see that hit is in open solicitation, not operating capacity generally. So when the board was saying that, they were recognizing that as more FIPs come into place, those people aren't going through open solicitation anymore, right? So we're starting to see a shift in that. Overall, we're still investing the same, if not more, in restoration technical assistance acquisitions. So with that in mind, then last biennium, for those who were here, if you remember, the board said we want to shoot for 25%. So the board actually put a little tighter on that gradual increase over time and said, can we try to shoot for 25% in focus investments? That's where we get to attachment C. So attachment C has lots of pretty colors, and if Carl Winter was here, he would be very proud of us for putting together a chart that he could take a look at. So to orient you, the left hand, the 2015-17 column, that is our current, if you look at the kind of very small print below, that's our current Grand Rond, Ashland, Sage Grouse, Harney Wetlands, Willamette Deschutes. That's the stack of our current focus investments and our capacity investments. So that's what we're doing in 15-17. It increased a little bit in 17-19 based on the requests that came in. What we then did is a projection forward. So if our goal is to get to 25% over time, if we wanted to get to 25% in 2019, what we would be saying, that line item that says $10 million, you start to see that we turn into just big blocks instead of little lines. That's because what we're saying is that offering would be a $10 million offering. So this is now what you would be telling the FIP committee is, we'd like you guys to stick in that $10 million range. You can't give them a total amount yet because, again, we don't know what budget projections are and things like that. But so staff took a look at that and said, we would propose to you that might be the right range. What you see is when we get to 2023, 2025, and 2027, we go over the 25%, but that's based on our current spending plan. And our spending plan has gone up every year except the extreme recession, the 2006-8 timeframe. I can't remember the exact time, but there was a point when we leveled out. Generally, we've increased, but we can't guarantee to you that we would increase. But the conversation that we want to have with you today is, are you comfortable with that amount, given that over time, since the inception of our agency, we've largely tended to increase, and you would have 2 more biennia that you could make an adjustment. So if you do the 10 million now, it doesn't mean that your next offering has to be 10 million. You could say, wow, we're in a downturn. We're going to make our next offering 6 or 7 million. So you still have a lot of time to adjust when we're talking that far out in spending plans. Which is the question that we're teeing up for you today, and the conversation that we'd like to move forward with this morning is, with all of that in mind, again, this being really the only kind of guiding decision that we want to put in front of you this morning, and recognizing the strategic plan that we have, which has a tie across focus investments and open solicitation and operating capacity. Is this board comfortable with the direction that previous boards have indicated, and is this a direction that you want the Focus Investment Committee to proceed with? So I'm going to open that up for conversation.
And before we answer that, I just want to make a note to the public that we will have public comment coming up here at 8:45. So if you haven't gotten your yellow sheets in to Derica, please get those in.
And if I might also be clear on that, there is specific public comment around the land acquisition. So if you're doing public comment just on the land acquisition, it has its own space. So it's just general public.
Just general public, good. Yeah, and that is also true for the conservation partnership. So, okay, Stephen.
Yeah, Steve here. Maybe Eric answered this yesterday, but one of the concepts was, if I recall, that as FIP got increased funding, there'd probably be less proposals coming in for restoration, specific restoration grants. Has there been, what was the level of grants that came in this past biennium versus the previous call?
So we have, as Eric mentioned yesterday, we do have a lower number of grants that are coming in, but we think that's due to a number of factors. So a piece of that is, I would say of our FIPS, in particular, the Grand Ronde, some of the Harney Basin stuff and the Sage Grouse stuff all was coming through open solicitation before. So those grants have shifted into FIPS. It's a little bit tougher to say that with the Deschutes and the Willamette because they had been FIPS for so long. Now, if those FIPS didn't exist, they would be going through open solicitation, right? But they've also been around since 2008, so it's hard for us to gauge that as directly. And then the Ashland one, they were never coming in before, so that's a new lift. So one factor in the decreased restoration grants could be that they're moving into the FIPS. Another factor is what Eric talked about. We've got more people coming in and doing technical assistance and design. We have people wanting to make sure that their grants are fully ready before they come in. Eric and Liz and the RPRs have done a great job of shifting how we review those grants. And I think it's really starting to roll back to the grantees and they're understanding the bar that they need to get to before they come in. So I think there's a lot of factors. We are lower, but I don't know that I can point explicitly that it's this, but I believe this is a contributing factor, and we've asked the staff to track it, but we don't have enough. We're basically 2.5 years into this, so we don't really have enough data to be able to fully tease it out to the level I think I'd like to see it, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, because if I recall during the discussion of the general guidance, that was one of the expectations that was going to happen. So,
yeah. And to add to that, these next set that come in will have been coming through open solicitation before. So the strategic action plans that we've been developing are with people who are going through the open grant cycle right now. So I would say the first biennium is a little funkier again because of the Deschutes and the Willamette. But what we're seeing in the grants that are coming in, a lot of them are ones who have been in your open solicitation pool for a while. The other thing that Eric mentioned yesterday is we're finding that people who are working in a FIP, it's a lot of work. And so they're tending to apply less even in their other areas for open solicitation just because they are laser focused on their FIP project.
so what was the percentage drop roughly? Just roughly. I know it varies a lot from.
The percentage drop?
For the record, Eric Williams. I don't have an exact figure on percentage drop, but I think what we're talking about is a drop in the number of applications. In terms of the dollars that you've awarded, those have continued to increase. So what you saw in our open solicitation presentation yesterday was a target of $8 million for restoration grants for this cycle. That is a number that is higher than it was before the FIP started.
And for the record, there, Maida Lofsgarden, there's a reason for that. Your budget has increased. So this is the other challenge, right? We now have what do we have? I should know this since I'm in charge of the agency. $106 million
109.
spending plan. And so grants, if you remember, we have to, as I said at the beginning, we have to draw a cut line based on the spending plan. So there are always grants we want to fund that are sitting under that. So that's the other challenge is we can't really say, to Eric's point, yeah, we're funding more projects, but we're funding more projects because you guys have a higher budget to fund projects, and so we can go further into that.
Yeah, I was thinking more on the amount
proposal
requested funding, not necessarily those that were funded. So.
Yeah, we would want to dig into that a little bit more. I don't think we can absolutely do that analysis. I don't know that we could do it at the table for you.
And that total was 109.
I inverted the number.
Yes, 109.
Right.
That's how much money we have. Thanks, Co-Chair
Liza
Robinson.
Jane?
Liza Jane, the FIP capacity, $1 million all the way across, what's that?
Those are the grants that you all provided $1 million for what we are, those focused investment development grants. So We have a number of them now across the state where what we are doing is helping them to either develop or refine their strategic action plan, to develop the governance for their partnership, and to work on the components that basically get them to the level of having a strategic plan and a high-performing partnership. What we recognize in that case is there are way more of those than you will ever have funding for implementation grants. But we believe, and this is in partnership with folks like NRCS, Fish and Wildlife, and others, that if we can get communities across the state to be strategic, they're more competitive across the board for funding. So you as a board decided to make a specific investment in that so that we can kind of raise all boats in the state who want to have strategic plans and high-performing partnerships.
So I don't see that on the spending plan broke out.
Oh, it is.
On attachment A?
We actually changed, thank you for that catch. We actually changed the title. It's line 23, development FIPS. We had changed them from capacity to development.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Paul?
Thank you. Paul Henson. So Maida, it's sort of, I was thinking about asking this question before Stephen asked his, and to some extent the dialogue you guys had might have answered it, but I just want to maybe summarize and understand a little better. First of all, I think the projection looks consistent with the, with the strategic plan. And so that's, to me, that jibes, but I'm just wondering about capacity. So is it a wash or is it a trade-off, like less work for you and your team on individual grants because it's now bundled in FIP potentially, or there's some trade-off? Or I was just thinking that's a pretty big jump. And I know from personal experience, FIP process, at least with the sage-grouse stuff, was pretty intensive and remains intensive. Are you guys ready to do that, I guess, is really my question.
For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, we actually, and I skimmed through some of the stuff yesterday when we talked about capacity tied to the strategic plan, but we do have a request in for the agency request budget to add another partnerships person. What we've found, and this is actually, I think, worked well, although if something comes flying from the back of the room and hits me in the head, then staff don't agree with this. What we've found is for the majority of our FIPS, we have the local RPR who is managing the individual grants, because we can't just lump sum grant. Like we can't give out $12 million. They're still in individual grant agreements by statute. So we have the local RPRs who are actually working with the grants, with rare exception. There are a couple places we don't do that. And then the partnership person manages the partnership. So they're going to the partnership meetings. They're working on the partnership capacity funding. Eric Hartstein, for example, is traveling to Eastern Oregon a lot. He's not managing the individual grants. Karen Leindecker is. And that has seemed to work really well because our RPRs really know how to run the individual grants. And again, in Karen's case, a lot of those applicants were coming through open solicitation before, so it's that balance. That said, when you add that many more, we believe that we need another staff person and have put that request in. And it's been, we haven't had anyone say that that didn't make sense as we've informally discussed it, but we'll see what happens with the governor's budget and the legislative budget.
Great. Other questions? Rosemary.
Rosemary Furphy. Thank you, Maida. I'm trying to look ahead and thinking of spending cycles in that the FIPS that are currently going through their process, they will fade out. I mean, there's a number of years in which they'll be funded. We have new ones coming in, and will we see, as, for example, the Grand Ronde, they finish their FIP, do those projects then come in more under open solicitation? There's sort of waves of the FIPS drop off, new FIPS come on, but then there may be, is there anything we should be thinking about in that cycling, if you will? And is that what's anticipated? I'm not sure I'm thinking of it in the right way.
For the record,
as we look ahead.
You are exactly right in the kinds of things we have to think about and the kinds of things we just don't know, right? So Rosemary's is right on. The Grand Ronde's going to come off. Those projects would go into open solicitation. Another FIP would come in, and you've got funding on the FIP side. And that's why, from my end, I want to be really clear that at the highest scale, what we are talking about is restoration grants, acquisition grants, technical assistance grants, monitoring grants. And they are just coming through two different lenses. And we've learned this actually about the FIPs themselves. If you remember, we did the analysis of the partnerships. We talked about it in June at the board meeting, had Jennifer Allen here. They are seeing the same thing, that it is so intense to operate a partnership. Paul mentioned this about the staff, but it's about the grantees too. That they'll cycle in for a big chunk of funding, and then they may actually say, okay, we got to step back and take a breather. We're going to go through open solicitation, get our next plan ready to go. So for a FIP to operate at that high a level for a really long time is a tough thing to do. So I think you're right, Rosemary. We're going to see them cycle off. Some of them may be applicants in the next cycle. They may be ready. Other ones are going to cycle over to open solicitation, but then you're bringing in a new set into focus investment. So it's really is more about the lens, not about, in my mind, who it's. Yeah, I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but I think it is. You're going to see a lot of that going on.
Will and then Ron.
I heard a quote about an analogous problem that somebody else was dealing with, and they said it's not a trade-off, it's a balance. It's not open solicitation or FIPS. It's just balancing how we want to manage the money to do the same kinds of work. So it's not like having FIPS is deeply bad for open solicitation, or open solicitation, is harming FIPS, because they're both doing restoration effectiveness monitoring and blah blah blah. So we're getting all the good work done in the state. It's just, as Meta says, through a different lens that we're kind of allocating those dollars for the same kinds of purposes.
Great. Ron.
Ron Alvarado. I'm trying to get my thoughts together here, but I'm hoping that as these FIPS, in NRCS we call it the off-ramp. You go into an area and there's a specific goal that you want to achieve in that area. You dedicate, commit funds in that period of time, and hoping that we move the needle. And if I'm hearing that we're going to open it up back to open solicitation, did we ever achieve those goals? Are we going to continue to invest the same amount of money we did with the FIP with open solicitation? So I'm hoping that, we see an off-ramp, and hopefully with that amount of dedicated funding that we do move the needle in that area. Am I?
So Maida Lofsgarden, for the record, that's one of the reasons, Ron, if you look to the spending plan under line item 24, that we've been investing in the focus investment effectiveness monitoring. So there were a set of goals that they set out at the outset. We have been partnering really closely with the various FIPs on both their monitoring grants that they proposed to us, but also, and Renee's mentioned it yesterday in the conversation, what are those gaps that we may have with certain programs, and how can we actually do monitoring to help fill those? We've been working with all of the FIPs to put together those logic models so that we can say, all right, if we know in 50 years this is where we want to be, what are the indicators that we're on the right path? So I do feel like that absolutely is the case. And largely those that are going back into open solicitation, which is what I love, is they're going back with a strategic plan in place. So they may be applying to us grant by grant by grant, but they now have this plan in place that is what those grants are coming from. And that's where we hope for the development FIPs as well, is they are more competitive by virtue of having gone through this planning process, and more competitive for things like RCPP and other programs as well.
Right. Alan?
Alan Henning. So, Will, I heard your point about balance, and it really is a balance between the FIPS, open competition grants, but it's also a distribution. And the FIPS bring a focus to a particular geographical area, and that reduces, in my opinion, the distribution a bit of the grants, because you're taking some from open competitive grants, put it in the FIP program, as Maida said in the very beginning. That's where that money's likely going to come from. And so there is a balancing act that goes on. And when you have 6 FIPs now, and maybe you add 2, 3, 4 more, you're going to focus that spending in particular geographical regions. And you have to remember that grants, open competitive grants are needed for the other locations as well. And so we do have an effect on folks who are out there running their watershed councils, aren't part of FIPS. And so we've got to find that balance that's equitable. We've got to make sure that they have opportunities to continue funding their smaller projects. I mean, there's big benefits with the FIP process. It's playing out very, very nicely. But we also will impact others who may not be part of FIP processes, so we've got to keep that in mind.
So Maida Lofsgarden, for the record, there's one kind of big piece that I want to highlight in what Alan said, and then just a technical adjustment to it. So Alan's right. What Alan just highlighted is the reason we have you all, right? That's the conversation. I'll just tell you as staff, really like these categories because it helps you all not just say, well, how much do I want to put in small grants? It starts to chunk those into bigger categories, and I think you guys can have that high-level conversation that Alan's talking about. We have this balance in the state where OWEB funding, our funding was passed in every county of the state by a 3/4 margin statewide, right? We're a very popular statewide program, and we can't forget that. And we have a strong push, and Ron and Paul and Rosemary know this, that we have to show how are we moving the dial, how are we achieving outcomes over time. So the nice thing is in having both of those, you're able to do both. You're able to spread money across the state, and you're able to say, and in these areas, here's how we're moving the dial over time. The one thing, technical correction I would make, Alan, is we have not reduced open solicitation at all. As Eric mentioned, we actually have the highest funding ever for our open solicitation grants, and that's, again, in large part because the pot has continued to grow. So you do have to think about what Alan's saying down the road, but we have not at any point in time in this program actually had to cut our open solicitation grants. What you are doing is saying basically with the increase, some of that is going to open solicitation, but we're also increasing focus investments. At some point in time, they keep saying this will level out, right? And then that becomes yeah.
Okay. So I had a question from Molly, and then I'm going to have Maida just restate the sense that she needs from the board today so we can move along.
Thank you. This is Molly Kyle. And I'm going to just play the new kid card a little bit with two questions. One is, what was the rationale behind the previous discussions to increase the FIP line? I'd like to know the history that led us to this decision and where we are now. The second question is kind of very basic, which is, what are the goals that you have out of a FIP grant that might be different than what you would have out of an open solicitation grant? So what's the objective of each of those grant mechanisms?
All right. For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, and I'll put the question in your head while I'm answering Molly's. So to Jason's point, what we're looking for you right now is a sense of if we want to increase to 25%, that's about a $10 million FIP program. Are you guys comfortable? And again, we're not asking for an official vote because there isn't a money transaction. We just need to be able to say to the committee, when you're selecting, are you comfortable with around a $10 million range, which would get us up to the 25%? So that's the question. Molly, to your point, there's two pieces. The first, how did we get to this? Again, starting in 2008, we tested with the Deschutes and the Willamette, and then soon after with the Klamath, this idea of going with a high-performing partnership, investing a multi-million-dollar investment for multiple grants over a time period to get to Ron's point, if we can move the dial differently. In many cases, it is not that those folks in the FIP are getting more money. I would say the Deschutes, one of the challenges in the Deschutes is they were so competitive that they were competing out all of the other grantees in that region. And so part of our kind of behind the scenes was let's pull them out and let them operate on their own so that we can bring some of these other grants in. But the goal is to say if we can focus those dollars, even if they're not getting more, if they know the money's coming and they can stage their projects differently, is that going to move the dial in a different way? Can we check off some projects in the Deschutes instead of waiting every 6 months and hoping you get a grant? And what we're seeing is that there's a lot more monitoring to go on that. We've set up a logic model so that we can follow that, but they are much more able to plan. We said they had to have a strategic plan in place to do that. So it wasn't just, hey, Molly, you're a great person. They had to come to us and really prove that they could could govern and set up their system that way. So that was the original thinking. That's what we hope to get differently. The conversation about that percentage was, so if you look at that graph, right now, 62% of our funding goes through open solicitation. So the largest majority of our funding goes there. But if we as an investment portfolio want to have a range of these, the feeling was open solicitation shouldn't be our only portfolio. Part of it is our base operating capacity that gets the work done on the ground. And part of it is what I would call kind of your international investment fund. Let's try some new and bold and innovative approaches, and this was one of those. So that's why it was a start small. Let's increase it over time. We started at about 18%, and this would get us up to the 25%.
Okay, Will had a quick comment.
Will Newhouser for the record. So I just want to affirm from the board perspective everything Maida just said and complement with one other thing, which is in the FIPS at our level, we're allocating, based on their plan over 6 years, we're allocating a certain amount of money, and staff works with the FIPS on the actual projects underneath those and the timing of those. And one of the things this affords is, they were planning to do a land acquisition out in 2 years, say, and restoration projects earlier, but the landowner suddenly says, I want to do the deal now. That affords them the flexibility within their team to say, hey, how can we adjust our plan and pull this one forward and push something else out later, which would be extremely difficult through an open solicitation and land acquisition thing to then try to do through our existing structure. So, and all of this is designed to take a slightly different analogy from the international investment perspective to say, in addition to supporting, small grants for really one-off teeny little things and open solicitation grants of single projects, to say we want to be able to support partnerships that are working together with a long-term plan. And so sort of a tiered ecosystem of restoration capacity, if you will. People who can only do really small projects, people who can do pretty good-sized projects, and people who can manage multiple projects simultaneously of good size. So that at least is my sort of perspective of the 6 years, or whatever it was, from the conception of the thing to when we got to the first set of FIPS out there.
Great. Alan?
Alan Henning. And Molly, to add to what Maida said and to what Will said, emphasizing the point about the SIPs really bring together bigger, stronger partnerships where they can leverage off each other and their own staffs so that they can share the burden, so to speak. That's been proven out. The other thing, too, is on the long-term funding aspect of it, the match money that they go after for the FIPS, they've been more successful in getting that long-term match money in long-term projects, knowing that they've got 6 years of funding, if in fact they do well. Knowing that they've got 6 years of funding, it puts them in a better position to be competitive for that match money and for long-term projects as well.
Okay, so we're getting a little bit behind, sir, so I want to pull us back to the question that Maida had asked, and that is the board comfortable with using the 25% target, or roughly $10 million in the FIP program as they move forward, knowing that we will have opportunities to discuss this multiple times and vote on it at some point in time? So this would be not an official vote, but is the board comfortable with this target moving forward? Alan?
Probably contrary to what Will's going to say, I would be more conservative than $10 million. I'd probably go somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 or $8 million rather than $10 million. You probably expected me to say that, but that's because I want, it's the question of distribution for me, is making sure that we've got open competitive grants for other folks who aren't part of FIPS, and that we're distributing the funding that way. We're still young in this program, and we want to make sure that we can keep and build and refine the infrastructure that we have for the FIPS program. I'd be more willing to take less a big step than the $10 million step.
Okay. Laura and then Will.
Laura Masterson. So I am a huge supporter of the FIP program, and I arrived on the board right at that moment where FIPs kind of went, whoops, we better take a break from these because they're so big, and we can't do the funding this biennium. We have to push it out another biennium, because and I know that's not what you're anticipating in this little pie chart here. That's different, but I think, and you can talk about that in a minute. But I think what I'm seeing is maybe what Alan's saying. I would be concerned about. Like, how do you be bold but not overpromise? And I'm not going to be here, so you guys are going to get to do whatever you want to do. But I think I would say 7. What's the historical gain, Ben, on the budget?
Program.
And if you're going up 7%. If you stayed flat and you go up 7%, does that come out of open solicitations, that 7%? So my question is, what does that number look like to stay at 25? Because if you do that now, then the board can always, in those other bienniums, inch it up. And maybe just philosophically, is that easier? It seems like it's harder to pull back a grant program than it is to say to the people and the partners, oh, now we have more than last year.
So, Maida Lofsgarden, just for clarification, we did not, the reason we put a pause is we only had like 9 months between the first one and the second one, because we started the first one late and would have been starting the second one early. So it was not, it was a, wait a second, we can't start them this quickly. We want to get on a biennial schedule. So I just want to be clear, it wasn't a panic about too many. It was a worry that we started the first set too late to start the next set in the next biennium. That said, the rest of that absolutely is your guys' decision. Will?
Yeah, so the chart that is up, Will Newhouser for the record, the chart that's up there is helpful because at the approximately 10 level, it gets us to 25% next year, but it still actually falls in the biennium after that.
And you have a chance to adjust.
And have a chance to adjust with the purple that appears at the top on the 23, 25 line, if you wanted to keep it at 25 and not by keeping the program at the same size. And it feels a little different I think to respond, I can't remember which one of you, to reduce the program because of course these are running for 3 biennium each, so it's not quite the same as that. In any case, for my own position, I fall in that 8 to 10 range is pretty comfortable. The reason I sort of fall towards the higher end is because the next 2 biennium are still at 25 or less, so we're still out 6 years before we would get more than 25.
Okay, go on, and then Laura.
Ron Alvarado, I guess I'm not as conservative, so I think the 10 million sounds reasonable to me. I just want to remind us as a partnership is that there's other investors investing in, when you talk about providing certainty throughout the state, that there's other investors that if we continue to work together, we can address those areas that need perhaps more of the single project related activities, right? I think we're there. We've also done a better job of building capacity together, right? So amongst ourselves as partners, we leverage our funds to build capacity at the same time. So I just see these resource problems that we're facing today are just much more complex, and they are costing more. These fires, these droughts, they're bigger. The fires are bigger. They're costing more money, and I'm just not sure we'll keep up with that pace if we don't achieve that 10 million. As a non-voting member, just a thought.
Okay. Stephen, and then Gary.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at the math, and if you jump up in one biennium 10 million, that's about 4 new projects, and then you have to go on pause for 1 or 2 bienniums?
No, so you do the 4 projects, and remember, those other projects are falling off. So that's why, if you look at that chart, a set of projects fall off, you pick up another set of 4. A set of projects fall off. So from then on, you're just rotating projects on and off. So there is no pause in this. And that's all of our current projects, Steve, all of the bright colored lines, after next biennium, those end. And so then you've got, at the bottom, you've got the ones you just started, and then you run another solicitation. So there is no pause.
So the 19 to 21, you would have 4 new projects
Right.
in the 6 remaining projects, so you'd have 10.
Yep.
Then the following, you
Have
would,
the
in
4 and
essence,
then
could have
4
6
more.
new more.
Yeah, you would have, the 6 would drop off, you would have the 4, and then you would have 4 more. So after that, we're continuing in kind of the 8 to 10 range from there on out.
Because once the 6 drop off, can't you add 6 more back in?
We could add 4 more back, because again, that's getting to that 10 million. You would actually kind of start to, so you could, the board could choose to do a higher number.
Depends on, because Will Newhouser for the reg, so it depends on how big each of the FIPS are. So not all of the FIPS propose the full 2 million. So sometimes you would get 6 out of that
Right.
block, and sometimes you get 4 out of that block, or depending on the actual proposals.
Gary?
This is Gary. So now that we're thinking out here a long ways, and so this is another what if in here, and not knowing whether Ag Heritage Program gets funded or not, but couldn't that potentially take some of the load off the acquisition money? And looking in here, there's like $10 million that we've got in here for that.
For the record, Gary, actually no, because legally, the reason we're asking for the new Ag Heritage Program is those are projects that legally cannot be funded through OWEB. So it wouldn't take the pressure off. I like the concept, but it would not.
Okay.
Meg?
So Maida, I'm not brand new, but I think I'm new enough that I don't think I have as good a grasp of what the FIPS actually look like that some of the longer term members do. The concept makes perfect sense to me, and and maybe I just haven't educated myself enough. I don't have as good a sense of what they actually look like, the current ones. So it's I'm finding it harder to evaluate. That seems really abstract, this question of the projection. But because the concept I think what you're proposing, I would be in favor of signing off on that, knowing that things can change, there might be different decisions down the road. But for me, it would be kind of based on the idea of a focused investment partnerships for all the reasons you guys have been talking about, that it makes a lot of sense to go that way. So that's my 2 cents about it.
Yeah, so for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, and apologies, Jason, I've totally messed your morning schedule, but we made up
We'll
much
bring it
time
back.
yesterday. We'll get it back. So it's a great question, Meg, and I think that is the challenge that you're at. I think where the board went when Will's talking about what he was talking about and I was too, actually is that concept that as a funder, what's the direction that you want people to be thinking? So on its surface, I think Will described it really well. It's a set of partners. They have a series of grants just like open solicitation grants. An acquisition here, a dam removal over here, a working lands project over here. They just happen to be, they know that for the next 6 years, this is the money that they have, which is a very different thing than I have to apply for a grant. So if you think about the types of projects we fund are the same types of projects that are sitting over in that category. They just have a sense up front and can do a little bit more flexible rotation and tell other funders we've got a commitment of 10 million over the next 10 years. And so that was part of that increasing. And again, I want to be clear because we're proposing this, so this is the piece that we support. 1, that our staff can manage it. And 2, that we believe philosophically this is a smart direction, that we're only talking about 25%. There's still the vast majority of the money goes through open solicitation. But what we're saying is we actually do believe that there's a different way to think with that 25% of the dollars, and that it's a model that we believe should be continued to be tested.
Jason Robinson for the record, and I wanted to weigh in as well. And I agree with Meg that knowing that we have opportunity to look at this in the future, we're really looking at a target here today, and that target is at $10 million, and I could support that moving forward. What I've heard today from the board is that we have somewhat of a range from conservative to the $6 million range all the way up to a very supportive $10 million range. So is there anything further that you need to kind of hone that in, Maida, for staff?
For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, I actually, I think that we're fine. And so what I would say for the FIP committee, the folks who will be doing the interviews, that's the sense of the board, is that it's somewhere in that $6 to $10 million range, and that we would need to come back and be able to say, this is why we think it's 10. This is why we think that next project is an important project to fund. The one other thing, and this isn't fair, I'm just going to put this out because I realized that I'd forgotten it earlier. When we got to that 25% last time, we had put in front of you a 30%, a 25%, and a 20% option for an increase over time. And so the board actually landed on the middle option. So this 25% actually wasn't the highest option. It kind of ended up in the middle of the road, and my guess is that's because of the personalities that we've got around the room. So this would have looked different had we gone with the 30% option a couple of years ago. So yeah, I think, Jason, we're fine. If the FIP committee folks are fine with understanding that that's kind of the range that the board wants you to operate in, or Will, you're going to be chairing this thing.
Will Neuhauser for the record. So remind me on the timing of, because we have FIP applications in now that we're going to be reviewing in November and bringing to the board in
January. Yep.
And so in January, we have to decide which ones we say yes or no to, even though I think at the very beginning you rolled out we won't, of course, know our budget for next year until July
Later.
Or whatever.
Yep.
So it's not that far away from when we need to be making that call.
Yes. So that's the reason that we brought this to you today, to get a sense, because what would happen then in January is the FIP committee would be bringing back a proposal just like regional review teams do. And you would be saying, we reviewed these 10. We reviewed these 10 applications, and of those, we think that these 5, really, there was a big break here, and we think these 5, and that's at $9.7 million, which falls within the 6 to 10, and that's where then you all can have the conversation about, okay, are we comfortable there or not? You are approving those FIPs. You cannot approve the final budget for them until July, because legally you don't have the money in your hand. But then from there on out, in our spending plan, those 4, 5, 6, however many projects will be sitting in that spending plan in April and July. So, which is why what we don't want to do, the reason we want this number is, I know the FIP committee, and they're going to love like 9 of them or 7 of them. And so they could come back to you and say, we want $25 million worth. So we wanted to get you guys to say, don't go over this. Because otherwise you would end up putting too much into the next cycle. But yeah, it's funky. You're making a decision early on those, which is why we want a limit.
Alan?
Alan Henning, that sounds like, as part of a member of the FIP committee, that sounds like a workable range, that $6 to $10 million, and we can figure out after the review of the process. I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind, Maida, to take a second. I was listening to you on the dates and what Will was asking about the time frame, to share with the board overall what's going on with the FIP review, so we all have a pretty good handle on that and the timing of it all. Again,
just the timing part?
Yeah, the timing, the FIP review, the FIP subcommittee review process, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Applications are in. The expert teams have already reviewed and provided their evaluations. Those are back to the committee. November 1st, the committee is having a call to talk about what questions they might have for the FIP applicants, and then the interviews are on the 8th and 9th, 7th and 8th? 7th and 8th of November. It's 2 days worth of interviews between the FIP committee members and each of the applicants. They do half-hour interviews with each of them. They then do a deliberation. It's all public. And then they will come back with a recommendation to you all in January. So they've already had one level of review from technical experts. Next level of review is FIP committee members. Then it comes to the board in January.
Liza Jane, then Meg.
Liza Jane, so you can't tell those people they're funded until July, is that correct?
We cannot officially sign a grant agreement with anybody till July. In January, you're going to say, we like these 6 and this is what your budget's going to be that we're going to carry forward in the spending plan. So we are giving them that indication in January. You just can't, we can't sign a thing. You can't officially approve the spending plan until you have a budget. But you're putting those into the spending, they then become placeholders in your spending plan.
But on the ground, they can't start anything until really the next year in most parts of the state, correct?
That's why we did what we did. So going back to Laura's point about it, that kind of mashup where we stopped for a biennium, last time they didn't even know they were funded until July. So then they were 6 to 8 months into the biennium before they were spending any money. This is why we backed it up to 6 months sooner. If we wait till July, then we're behind the 8 ball again. So what we're doing is saying we're letting you know early. So that you've got 6 months to plan. Instead of thinking that we got them stuck, we actually moved it up by 6 months because otherwise we were running a year behind on our grants. So we're trying to fix that issue.
Okay. Meg, and then we'll move forward with the next agenda item.
Meg Reeves, did you say that the FIP subcommittee's deliberations is that a public meeting?
Yes.
So we could go to it if we wanted.
You could, it would be so much fun.
We could have
Meg.
anyway, probably.
We would love to have you there. Yes, it is a public deliberation because the committee is deliberating toward a decision that the board is making around funding in this case. So it is and it was last time, and it is very interesting.
Yeah. So you'll let us know when that's happening?
No.
Okay.
So Jason Robinson for the record. So just wanted to circle back then that our funding range that we've decided on setting as a target at this point is $6 to $10 million. That'll be taken into consideration through the FIP review process. All right. Thanks, Megan.
Erica will send the details about the committee meeting out to the full board.
We're moving to public comment, open public comment, if we have any, Derica.
Erica, we have one.
So if anybody else wants to make public comment that isn't directed either to the land acquisition item or conservation partnership item, you better get your slips up to Derica really quickly, and we'll get you in the queue. First up, Claire Clock from Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District, Clock Farm. You've done this enough, you know how the drill works, Claire, but Derek will run the timer and the little lights will go as you move along.
You bet. Okay, Claire Clock, Clackamas Conservation District and Clock Farm from Corbett, Oregon. I've always been an advocate of upland projects since first starting my biology career 40 years ago. One of the things that I found yesterday with the open solicitations is it seems to be really stream-centric, and so I just sort of asked the board to consider your projects and do consider that upland projects are important too. The lack of pesticides, fertilizers, manure, and erosion management can lead to effects on both groundwater and surface water, and negate some of the positive effects of the physical restoration projects that we've heard about yesterday. And that doesn't mean that Ron brought it up earlier and listened to the conversation, is that there are other investors that do work in the uplands areas, but I would appreciate if you'd take a look at uplands in those projects and staff too. A second thing is I was so encouraged yesterday by the discussion about a 100-year water plan. To think beyond our own lifetime is a deep subject for a lot of people, and to hear as many of you comment positively on a 100-year water plan and being able to take it back to your respective representative organizations is just it's incredible. So thank you much.
Any questions or comments for Claire? Thank you, Claire. Next up, Aaron Minster with Curry Soil and Water Conservation District.
Good morning. I'm Erin Minster. I'm the technical coordinator with the Curry Soil and Water Conservation District and the Curry Watershed Partnership, which involves the district and the South Coast and Lower Rogue Watershed Councils. Thank you guys for coming to Gold Beach. And I'm here to thank you for your support of the Oregon State Weed Board program. We've been a grantee through that program, both the regular grant program and the recently adopted County Weed Control District program. Both have been pretty valuable to us. With the regular grant program, we use that funding to focus on EDRR, which is early detection and rapid response. That's been really great. We have a list of 5 to 6 weeds that we treat through that program. One of them is gorse. We do have some heavily infested areas in Curry County, but there's a large portion that is not. So we prioritize when we find from landowners, they call and they say, hey, I found one. We go treat it. That is one of the most cost-effective things that can be done. It's often not a very awesome thing because it's like, oh, we killed one plant. It barely shows up in the metrics. And one of the others is Cape Ivy. The only known sites have been reported in Oregon, are reported in Curry County. We have 15 of those. We are controlling most of them. A couple are inaccessible on some cliffs, so it's a little bit more difficult, but they've been being reduced. We work closely with Oregon Department of Agriculture for treating those as well. We also treat Japanese knotweed. We've been controlling that fairly well in several watersheds that have it in the riparian areas. So I feel we still find new sites, but we find that less and less often, so that's really encouraging. And Jubata grass, which is a lot of folks know as pampas grass, is marching up the coast out of California pretty readily. It really exploded here several years ago, and we're doing our best to keep it from spreading to our neighbors to the north. So it's a tough one. People really like it. And with the more recent county weed control district money, that's been really valuable as well. We do have treatment involved in that, but a larger portion of it can go towards kind of more organizational work and partnering. So we've been successful in doing that this year. We've re-engaged some of our partners and started to bring in some folks locally that we haven't worked with before. It's also allowed us to work with our neighbors in Coos County at both the state, local, federal levels to create a cooperative weed management area for Coos and Curry counties. We'll be having our first full partner meeting here in November, so we're pretty excited about that. It's a great way to share information, what's happening. All of us who see the weeds driving to work every day have somebody to talk to about it and how to kill it. We're also a member of the Gorse Action Group, and that's, kind of a similar type group that has really focused around trying to get a handle on gorse and also keep it from spreading to other areas of the state. Nobody wants it, for sure. We have a new partnership with ODF to work with their Sketch Mapper program, which is an aerial program. We're going to look for outliers in the southern part of the county where we don't have a lot of gorse. So these two sources of funding really kind of complement each other for us. And it just allows us to really kind of focus more on some outreach to the general public as well. And in that regard, I'd like to say that I know when I talk to individual landowners about noxious weeds, they're very thankful usually to have the additional technical assistance. Weeds don't, they win for a reason because they're hard to kill. And so folks try, they do try, people care, but for a lot of folks, it's just outside their capacity to do it. So, we share what we know, we do some treatments for those folks and try to get them the best help that they can. So they're always very grateful, hardly get a no when it comes to asking to treat noxious weeds. So, and in general, the weeds don't care, whose or what's it is. So they, it's really important for our other restoration as well to kind of keep those things at bay. So I just want to thank you for your support for that program, and thanks for coming, and have safe travels home.
Any questions or comments for Erin from the board? Thank you very much, Erin.
Okay, at this time, we're going to move into the public comment period for the land acquisition agenda item L on the agenda. So first up, we have Jim Desmond with the Nature Conservancy.
Good morning. For the record, I'm Jim Desmond, the Executive Director of the Nature Conservancy in Oregon. It's been my great pleasure to be down here with you the last couple of days and really commend this board on the great service that they're doing for conservation and the public. So thank you all. I'm here today to urge your yes vote for the transfer of 2 preserves in Yamhill County from the Nature Conservancy to the Yamhill Soil and Water Conservation District. If I could step up to 1,000 feet for a minute, the Nature Conservancy has a large system of land holdings in the state. We've protected over 500,000 acres in Oregon in our history, and 120 million acres worldwide. And it's important that we systematically go through our portfolio to see whether there are lands that we've acquired, restored, protected, that are in a condition where we can transfer them to a capable other conservation entity, which then frees up time and resources for us to go on and do new conservation. There's a finite amount of money we can raise in Oregon or anywhere, and if we just continue to acquire sites, there would be a point where we would have to stop because we would spend all available resources on stewardship. So this is something we've been doing systematically over the last 20 years. And what we do in these cases, and what's true here, is we try to find a strong local partner, someone who has great capacity on the ground, strong relationships in the community, the expertise to carry through on the stewardship and the promises that we've made to funders such as yourselves and our board and our private donors as well. And in so doing, when we do transfer a preserve to a local entity, we also find that increases local support for conservation. They're closer to the ground. In the case of the Soil and Water Conservation District here, they have a very strong relationship with the landowner community in a way that we could never have that same personal touch at a statewide level. That there's just not you can't do it at that scale. So there are advantages from our perspective. I call it with my staff the lift all boats theory, that if we're helping capacity at a local level through soil and water conservation districts, or we're transferring a preserve to a land trust, over time that helps those entities build their credibility in the community, which then lifts conservation across the state. This particular soil and water conservation district, I believe it's the oldest or one of the oldest in the state. They've got, we go through our own due diligence. We are very impressed with the capability of their staff, the leadership of the organization, the relationships that they've built with landowners. They've held easements, and their management of those easements for similar properties to these has been excellent. And they have a history of working on the ground and understand properties like this, and we have tremendous confidence in their ability to carry this stewardship forward. So I urge your yes vote, and I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has them.
Great. Any questions for Jim? Alan?
Thank you for your testimony. You've done all your due diligence, and TNC always does that well. If in fact something happened down the road, 3 years, 5 years, where the SWCD couldn't follow through on the stewardship process to continue improving, protecting, restoring this property, are there any contingencies that exist long-term that can make sure that it becomes within a holding of some other entity that makes sure that the stewardship goes on?
Jim Desmond, for the record, and I think Maida may have some additional things. There will be a written agreement signed here, and the OWEB staff may want to speak to the details of that, but there will be an agreement in place that the parties will sign that will set forward our understanding of going forward. So some of this will be documented
Yeah. For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, Ellen, actually, that's where we come in as the funder for this project, and Eric will speak to it shortly, but because we're the funder, we have the same long-term monitoring with this project that we then would with any other, regardless of whether it's the Nature Conservancy holding it or Yamhill, which is why statutorily they have to come to you to approve the transfer. So we are part of that mechanism about making sure that that long-term stewardship and maintenance occurs.
And Alan, if I could, Jim Desmond, for the record, I should also note that we raised stewardship endowment funds for this property that in your packet you'll see are being transferred to the Soil and Water Conservation District along with this transfer. So they will have dedicated funds for the purpose of this, which also ensures that there would be far less risk of the sort of scenario that you foresee where they were not in a situation to do this. So we are transferring funds along with this.
Okay, we had Will and then Liza Jane.
I don't know. That'll be for later.
Okay, Liza Jane.
Eliza J. McAllister, is this accurate to say that this is private land becoming public land?
Jim Desmond, for the record, in a legal sense, yes, we are a nonprofit. We are not a public agency. We like to think that we manage these properties on behalf of the public, and we're very cognizant of the public funding that funded this and other of our acquisitions. So we're somewhere between what, when you say a private landowner, that has certain connotations about need to make a profit or rights to do this, that, the other thing. We are a nonprofit that has a conservation mission that limits what we can and would do with a property. But yes, this will go into public ownership, and we as an organization view that as a good thing. We support public land ownership, and we've transferred literally millions of acres to public agencies in the United States of America. We, as an organization, are strong proponents of public land ownership. Did that answer your question, Liza Jane?
It did. How does the general community of Yamhill County, what's their position on this? Do you know?
We have
might not be the best person to answer that.
Yeah, we have testimony coming up shortly, I think, Liza Jane, that could answer that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you.
Jim.
So we'll come back.
We'll have a full,
then we'll have the full.
Yeah.
post-public comment.
Yeah, so Jason Robinson for the record. So Eric Williams will be up here soon to talk about the acquisition. So our next is Larry Oyua and Barbara Boyer from Yamhill Soil and Water Conservation District.
About the lights.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and Derica will be running the lights there, so when you see your red light, it's time to stop.
Okay. For the record, I'm Larry Oyua, the manager at the Yamhill Soil and Water Conservation District, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, and Jim, thank you for your good comments. I thought it might be helpful just to give a little bit of background about the district. We've been in existence for about 65 years. Like a lot of other conservation districts, we have several, I call it kind of our bread and butter programs that provide assistance to landowners for multiple conservation issues. We do CREP, we do ag water quality, we do RCPP with oak and prairie restoration. I could talk a long time about our programs, but the issue at hand really has to do with our lands protection program that we started in 2002. So the map you have before you is our current portfolio. There is one correction I'd like to make. The Muddy Valley property on there, 540 acres, should be coded red. That is actually owned by the district. And that brings me to my next point, that it's right next to one of the parcels that will be part of this transfer. The transfer includes two separate locations. The one next to the Muddy Valley property is called the Gar Farm that does not have the OWEB investment. The one up in yellow on the Gopher Valley Road is the parcel that has the Nielsen and Pew tracts that were invested by OWEB. So that's the one we're talking about. But just for your information, that this transfer from TNC includes two different properties. So I thought it might be helpful just to mention our funding. We do have a permanent tax rate that was established in 1986. We obviously write grants like a lot of other districts. We get private donations. We've had properties bequeathed to us like Miller Woods. We have income from a nursery that we grow native plants at Miller Woods. We have an annual plant sale that draws in about 900 people a year that we raise money on. We get stewardship funding as part of our acquisitions or donations or bequeaths, and a number of other types of donations. So that's kind of our elevator speech for our funding. As a local government, we have a municipal audit law requirement, so we're audited each year as a local government agency on all of our funding. So I just want to say that we have a very positive relationship with TNC, especially in the last 5 or 6 years. They've helped us with a number of the acquisitions that we've worked on. They have faith in us, obviously, by the testimony that Jim provided. So I want to try to give you confidence that we are a worthy candidate for this. We actually have long-term relationships with both properties. We did some of the initial inventory work on Fender's Blue Butterfly on the tracks that we're talking about right now through our staff. We have a habitat conservation plan in the county for Fender's Blue Butterfly recovery. We have a long-term staff. Most of our staff have been on at least 6 to 12 years. I've been with the district 20 years with a break working for ODA in the middle of that for about 10 years. We have good relationships with landowners, a lot of partners we work with. Fish and Wildlife in particular, and the Partners Program has worked on both these properties that we're talking about and will continue to do so. We have strong support from our board. Our board is a long-term, solid board that we stepped into land conservation clear back in 2001, held our first conservation easement on a working lands 720-acre farm on Crown Hill Farm in 2002, and we've grown to this portfolio today. We have strong support from the community. That question came up. Our board's very sensitive about the reaction and perception of the public. Every piece of land that we acquire through a donation or a grant, we have a policy of keeping it on the tax rolls. These two properties that would be in this transfer have already been taken off the tax rolls as an exemption, so they'll remain off the tax rolls. But we have very good support, so much support for Miller Woods. We get several hundred, if not 1,000 people come to Miller Woods each year. The local pub did a fundraiser for us. They gathered fir tips from some of our new plantings and created a Doug beer. And we made about $1,200 with the local pub. So lots of Miller Woods t-shirts and vests and hats sold. And the community is really looking for protection of important lands and, in some cases, public access. So it's a good fit for us. So I'm going to stop there. That's just an overview of the district, and let our chair, Barbara, make some comments.
Great.
Good morning, Barbara Boyer, Chair of the Board, Chair of Yamhill Solar Water Conservation District. I just wanted to echo what Larry and Jim had said, that we have a long history of building relationships with our landowners and maintaining properties, as you can see from this map. We have been engaged through this whole process. I have sat through most of the phone calls with Larry and TNC, and we are receiving favorable feedback from the community. And I'm pretty sure we're the first conservation district in the state to be asked to hold these properties, and we do not take that lightly. We understand the honor that this is, and we really hope that you will vote yes for this, and we're very excited for the future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Any questions for Larry or Barbara? Paul, and then Molly.
Hi, Paul Henson. A question, I know Jim mentioned that kind of stewardship funding would transfer to you guys. Is that something that you would incorporate into kind of your current capacity, or would you add some staff and to maybe take advantage of that and with this additional responsibility?
For the record, Larry Oiwa, it'll depend. A lot of work we do on our lands is contractors. So some of the work we do is our own staff, and some of it's contractors. So I would guess that at least a large portion of the annual stewardship work would be contracted out. We'd use that funding for that. We have one individual who's kind of our protected lands manager, Mike Crabtree. With this many properties, he's starting to need more help. So we've actually explored different models of part-time help to fill in seasonally. Some of this work, a lot of these lands is not a straight line. It's seasonal for weed control, mowing, other work. So we're not planning on adding a staff person at this point. Probably these two properties don't justify a full-time staff person, especially when we're going to be doing it with contractors.
Great. Molly, and then.
Hi, Molly Kyle for the record. I just want to try to understand your map a little bit more, if that's okay. It looks like the yellow are the two yellow areas down in the south are the two properties that would be transferred. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'll try to look at the map on the screen. Again, for the record, Larry Oiwa with the Yamhill Soil and Water. The two yellow parcels, we actually made this map as a result of working with a group that Will has been involved with, Yamhill Partners for Land and Water, and maybe he'll want to talk about that at some point. But we wanted to capture as a kind of an educational tool where other protected lands were, so that's why we've got some other things added. But the two parcels, yes, indeed, are next to the Muddy Valley property. The one to my right, I guess you're right too, is the Gar Farm. The one farther up to the left is the parcel that contains the Nilsson and Pew tracts.
Okay. And is the parcel, the Nature Conservancy parcel that's next to the Muddy Valley habitat, would those connect those two properties?
They do, yeah. It's actually, we had a board tour out there last week with Chris Seal from Fish and Wildlife and some other partners, just to let the board and some of our guests see the property. It's very, very exciting to look at that landscape where the TNC property goes up to the ridge, down to Muddy Creek. Our property goes from Muddy Creek up to the other ridge. So it's a pretty rewarding view to think about having the ability to manage and work on that whole ridge-to-ridge piece right through there, which would be, that's 540 acres. The Gar Farm is about 310. So, we're talking about 850 acres, to manage as one piece through there.
And then just one last clarifying, there's kind of that darker olive shading area. Is that then Nature Conservancy land that isn't being transferred?
The Muddy Valley one that?
No, it's kind of this larger.
The opportunity area. She's talking about the TNC opportunity areas.
Yeah. So some of you may remember Dan Bell. Dan Bell worked on our committee, and he helped us layer down what these TNC conservation opportunity areas were. They align pretty close with ODF&W's high priority conservation areas as well. So we just use that again as a tool as we're sitting now with other landowners to say, here are opportunity areas that we really want to try to focus in the years ahead. But those aren't protected lands.
But they're not, they're in private ownership. Okay, otherwise it's going, that's it.
I will say though, if I could, is that our Regional Conservation Partnership Program that focuses on oak and prairie restoration uses this map as one of our tools to help prioritize and target our work. And part of our strategy on the RCPP is to generate more interest in long-term protection, which is working actually quite well. So.
Perfect. Thank you, Larry and Barbara.
Sorry.
No.
Do you want to?
Laura Masterson, I just want to introduce your new OWEB board member. Next time, Barbara will be sitting in my chair. So, yeah, I don't know. Are we having a break here?
We will, yes.
Okay, you guys going to stick around a little bit? Okay, great. So you guys can mix and mingle, and I'll introduce Barbara more informally when we have our break. But we're excited. I'm excited that she's going to join you and represent ODA. Great. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Oh, Rosemary.
Question. I'm remembering our former board meeting in McMinnville, and we did a fascinating field tour after that to some oak restoration, and kind of a stream was running through it, and oak woodlands on the headlands, the hillsides. And we also visited a property, an elderly couple lived there, and it was a very interesting wildlife center. Where are any of these what we're seeing here, just to help us understand what we actually saw on the ground, which were fascinating. But again, this is just to help orient me. Thank you.
Okay, I got time.
Go ahead, Larry.
Again, for the record, Larry Oiwa, the property that I'm glad you brought that up, because we visited the Gar Farm, and I did not bring the picture of Maida holding the picture upside down. I do have that in my back pocket somewhere. So we visited the one that is in the yellow, right next to Muddy Valley. That was the one that had the stream going through it, and OWEB actually invested in a thinning project with TNC up on the hillside, and they pointed that out. We had to stop there along the road. The one with the elderly couple was the Muddy Valley property right across the street. I believe that's where we went up, and there was an old farmhouse right in the middle of that property. And so that's, for clarification, that was the location.
Just adjacent to that Muddy Valley.
Right. We did not go to the Gopher Valley one, which is more to the west.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Larry and Barbara. Jason Robinson for the record. So I will now have Eric Williams come up, and he's going to walk us through Agenda Item L, the land acquisitions. And I wanted to just note that we will have a vote decision on these actions. There'll be 2 potential motions. These are not funding decisions, however. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, co-chairs and members of the board. For the record, Eric Williams. In this item, item L, we do have 2 action items, and as Jason pointed out, you do have a quorum to vote on these. These are not grant awards. I'll take them in order. We've got first an extension project for Botts Marsh, and then we'll get to the Yamhill conveyance. First, on the Botts Marsh extension request, all of our acquisition grants are conditioned on completing all the due diligence and getting to closing by 18 months within the grant award. And if those funds aren't obligated by that 18-month time period, the rules specify that the board can then reprogram the money or decide to continue that obligation. That's not something that staff can do. And so we're coming to you with this request to extend the Botts Marsh award. Its 18-month period is coming to its end this month in October. They have made substantial progress toward closing on that property. They have had some challenges with land use approvals. This one involved a subdivision where the initial property owner is retaining some of the land, and there were some challenges and delays going through that process. It also, because of that subdivision, was a more complicated appraisal, and doing the appraisal review and going back and forth with our review appraiser and the applicants or the grantee's appraiser took some additional time. And in addition to that, it's an entity that's in transition with executive directors, and so board members have been stepping in, fulfilling some of the roles that typically the director might do. So all of those things are the rationale and the reason for us coming to you and recommending an approval of an extension for the Botts Marsh grant. And we recommend extending that for 1 more year, even though it won't likely take that long, but by doing a year extension, that'll prevent, if there are other unnecessary or other unexpected delays, we don't have to keep coming back to you for extensions. And so this request is for extending the closing deadline to October 31st, 2019 for Botts Marsh with all the conditions of the project remaining unchanged. I'll take questions.
Questions from the board? Alan?
Alan Heading. Eric, in the report on this, it says that the LNCT will deliver reports to OWEB in October. Has that happened for review? Have we received anything from them yet?
We are in constant contact with them, and we receive periodic updates on the status of all of the due diligence items, at least monthly.
Okay, but in here it says that they plan to complete all due diligence and submit it to OWEB in October. Has that happened, or are you just getting periodic updates?
No, it has. October is not over yet, so
I know.
yes, yeah. So we expect that they will be submitting all of those things by the end of the month. However, there's still some time between the time they get those documents to us and we can get to closing, because we have to have our attorney at DOJ review the material and other of our own due diligence items. And so this extension isn't likely to go very far beyond October 31st. However, they're not going to make the deadline that we have in our rules.
Is this land trust a recipient of any other acquisition grants from OWEB in the past?
They are.
They are?
Yes.
Okay.
Other questions? Meg, and then Laura.
Eric, does the land use delay involve opposition, local opposition, or just slow?
For the record, Eric Williams, I don't believe it's an issue of local opposition. I think it has more to do with a landowner having certain expectations that may not have matched with the local planning authority's zoning ordinance.
Okay, thank you.
Laura, did you have a question? No. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and entertain a motion on this, and then we'll move to the next topic. Oh, we have another question. Liza Jane.
Yeah. This is Liza Jane. Is there any concern of setting a precedence for extension which would kind of weaken our position of the original rule for this?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. For the record, Eric Williams, it's not something that we take lightly, and we typically are fairly firm with our grantees that we don't want to get into an extension situation. And so when we do come to you for these, we want to be clear that there are extenuating circumstances that weren't anticipated at the front end of the process. We don't want this to become a routine expectation that they can take longer than the period in our rules. If we did get to a situation where we're finding that just because of the programmatic things that they do, we would probably want to revisit the rule rather than continue granting extensions.
For the record, on that Maida Lofsgarden, that's actually the reason we put in rule that we come to you. Where I would worry about it becoming routine is if it was a conversation between staff. So we've already set the bar that our grantees understand that it's a very different place with an extension, that it has to come to the board and we have this public conversation.
And do you have a plan for if it doesn't happen after October 31st, 2019? What if?
For the record, Eric Williams, if it doesn't happen by then, it really depends on what the status of the transaction is. But I'd say probably the most likely outcome would be that those funds would be recaptured and reprogrammed by you into the spending plan.
Okay.
It's 1 year. Mm-hmm.
Right. Will Newhouser, I move the board approve the staff, I move the board extend the closing deadline to October 31st, 2019 for the Marsh Project OWEB grant number 2179901 with all other conditions of the project to remain unchanged.
We have a motion by Will. Do you have a second?
I second.
All right, second by Meg. Further discussion? All right, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
All right. Again, for the record, Eric Williams. The second half of this land acquisition item is the Yamhill Oaks conveyance, which you heard, I think, very good introductory comments to in terms of the landscape here, the rationale from our grantee, which was TNC, for wanting to do the conveyance. I'll briefly describe to you our process when this happens, and this is also included in the staff report. By our statutes and our rules, when conveyances are requested with properties purchased previously with OWEB funds, they are subject to board approval. Again, staff cannot do this approval. And also, the rules are very clear that it shall not result in profit. The board can require conditions on the conveyance to ensure consistency with the intent of the grant and ensure the ability of the party receiving the land to carry out obligations under the grant. And so that triggers a review process for us because we want to come prepared with confidence to you that the entity that would be accepting the property has the same ability, similar ability as the original grantee that you did evaluate and review to carry on managing that property in perpetuity. And so what we do in this situation is request that the new entity essentially fill out the organizational capacity portion of our land acquisition application. And we review and evaluate that as we would a new grantee coming into the system. And we have implemented a team approach to acquisitions among the staff. And so Courtney Schaff, sitting behind me here, is the person on staff who runs the organizational capacity review And so she did that process with Yamhill SWCD and concluded that they do have sufficient capacity for the reasons really that Larry and Barbara articulated before you today, that we have a high level of confidence that this property will be managed well in perpetuity, as was desired with the initial acquisition grants, which were there were two separate grants, 2008 and 2013, for the Nielsen and Pugh properties. And also, it was mentioned earlier that there is a substantial stewardship endowment that TNC is providing to Yamhill SWCD, so they don't have to start from scratch with fundraising to cover the expenses that they'll incur in doing their annual monitoring and annual stewardship and maintenance of the property. And so based on our review, we do recommend approval of the conveyance of the Yamhill Oaks Preserve from TNC to Yamhill SWCD, subject to Yamhill SWCD following through with the conditions of a conveyance agreement that is to be signed by OWEB, TNC, and Yamhill SWCD, and sufficient DOJ review.
Questions?
So Will Newhouser. So a little bit more of a statement for the board. So as Larry mentioned, being in Yamhill County, both TNC and the Soil and Water Conservation District have been part of a group called the Yamhill Partners for Soil and Water, and have worked together to produce a strategic map, of which this is a sub-summary. I think that the two partners here have understated the degree to which they've been working together over the last at least 10 years probably that I know of. Working cooperatives is probably the two major entities doing conservation work in the county in terms of acquisitions and easements. A couple of tribes also have some important properties there. The strategic plan has been built together, but in addition, one of the things that we did is to acquire a grant with COLT, the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts, to do a capacity analysis for conservation, and in particular for permanent preservation in the county. And that went through and identified strengths and weaknesses of all the partners there, and then looked at ways in which they could cooperate together, maybe in different ways, in order to fill any gaps. And one of the things that has been really impressive in a way is the way all those partners have stepped up to bring conservation to a higher level in the county. And one of the premier pieces of that has certainly been the partnership between the Nature Conservancy and the district to work together to get deals other than these done. So TNC has been working on both the deal-making side with entities in the county, in particular the Conservation District, as well as doing conservation work together on the ground. I think Eric has touched on the two main items that I had as a board member from a sort of fiduciary responsibility, which are what is the capacity of the Soil and Water Conservation District to take this on, in particular since they aren't a Land Trust Alliance certified land trust, to make sure that we do the due diligence on the partner at the expertise level, since we don't have that external validation, if you will. And then the other side is the financial capacity to take this on. So I'm very encouraged to see the transfer of stewardship funds to the Soil and Water Conservation District to support a higher level than they would otherwise be able to do on their own funding, or have to go do further funding just to get that started. So for me, those two things were the main concerns I had as a board member, and just the color. And if you have any questions about how they've worked together in the past, I'm sure either of them or I would be happy to go into more depth if you have concerns.
Great. We got a comment from Maida, and then Meg and Gary.
For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, just to clarify one point that Will stated, the reason that, and Kelly or Larry, you can catch me if I'm wrong on this, but the reason that the Conservation District is not an LTA certified land trust is because they don't certify conservation districts. So it's not by any virtue of the district itself. And the one other thing I wanted to mention which I think leads to the other question. So we completed the capacity evaluation, and that is our responsibility. The one other thing I want to highlight about Yamhill Soil and Water Conservation District is they have already also been a tremendous leader on the conservation side. They are our go-to place when we talk about testing riparian programs and figuring out how to work differently with landowners on riparian programs. They have led trainings on our behalf. So the other piece, which we know the property, we already invested in the property, is that I will just say from my perspective, knowing the background of that district, they are also a district who is actively managing Oak through the RCPP, actively managing riparian areas, and actually is a statewide leader in that work. So I think they have the stewardship fund, but they also really have the interest and expertise in this property as well.
Great. Okay, Meg?
I just have an informational question. Is the property, is this a transfer of ownership or of an easement? I mean, it is ownership of, what is it an ownership of, I guess? The fee?
For the record, Eric Williams, it is a transfer of a fee simple property from TNC to the Yamhill SWCD.
So the property itself.
Property, okay. And my other question, really, it's not out of any concern in this particular case. I want to be clear about that. But at some point, I would like to get a better understanding of what do we do with land acquisitions in terms of reversion if all the wheels fall off, everything falls apart. And I don't even know if we have to do it right now, but because it really is not an issue about this proposal. It just occurred to me that I don't really know how we deal with that. So.
For the record, Eric Williams, I'll just answer briefly, and we can certainly provide more information down the line. But part of our capacity review on any applicant that comes in is looking at what do they have in place to handle some future scenario where the organization dissolves? Do they have other land trusts that they've partnered with that might be willing to step in? Do they have some other provisions for following through on managing those properties in perpetuity? And so that is a very important piece for us because while organizations may be really healthy right now, no one knows what's going to happen 50, 60, 100 years. We talked about water infrastructure 100 years down the line. A lot can happen in that amount of time, and that is the challenge in making these investments in perpetuity, and that's the reason that we probably spend a lot more time and effort than maybe our applicants would like us to in analyzing organizational capacity. It probably feels to them like we're overly scrutinizing them, like we're being too picky on a lot of things, but that's the reason that we do it. We want to have as many assurances in place as we can so that that situation doesn't happen. And I think for those land trusts that are accredited through the LTA, that is something that they also have to think about. What are successor organizations that might be able to step in if something should happen and they decide to dissolve their organization?
And for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, the other, there are two reasons. Eric's right. We pay a lot of attention to how land trusts and districts and others have that succession plan in place. We also, as a public funder, and NRCS is the same way, we have, in the case of an easement, we have a third-party right of enforcement. So if every wheel falls off and the engine falls out, the state actually has the ability to, on an easement, to take that and then go find somebody so that we don't lose that. And on a fee simple property, we actually have a formal conservation easement that does the same thing. So the state is we are the backstop to ensure that public investment does not go away. So every wheel, engine off, Eric is our backstop.
And Eric does not want to become a land baron.
Okay, Gary, then Laura, and then we'll entertain a motion on this.
Ms. Gary, I heard Maida answer my question. It was just, has OWEB made investments in this property before? And I think I heard Maida say that they had.
For the record, Eric Williams, we invested in the initial purchase by TNC. We helped fund the initial purchase. And then Larry mentioned that we also funded some restoration work on one of the properties.
So then are we funding this purchase twice?
For the record, Eric Williams, no, there's no, we're not asking for any additional funds here. This is simply for the board to approve conveyance of the property from one entity to another.
Okay, Laura?
Laura Masterson. I just wanted to echo what both Maida and Will said. I am a board member on the East Multnomah SWCD, and we have really always looked to Yamhill as a leader in this acquisitions and easements program across the state. They were really one of the first to get started, and they've been very thoughtful in the way that they have pursued this. So I just wanted to, one more little shout out.
Okay.
And I'm happy to make a motion.
Want to make a motion? Okay.
I move the board approve conveyance of the Yamhill Oaks Preserve, OWEB grant number 208-108 and 212-108 from the Nature Conservancy to the Yamhill Soil and Water Conservation District, conditioned on staff and Department of Justice approval of all the final forms, approval of the final forms of all conveyance-related documents.
You have a motion by Laura, second?
Second by Will.
Second by Will. Any further discussion? All right, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right, motion carries.
Look at Eric.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, thanks for, Eric, thanks for saving my timeline.
Congratulations, Yamhill. Yes. We'll have a few more comments.
All right, we're going to take a break until 10:15. Will Newhouser, for the record, will get going on our agenda. Next up is agenda item M in your packet, tide gates. With Renee and Ken.
And Maida.
And Maida.
Good morning, co-chairs, members of the board. For the record, Renee Davis, Deputy Director. There are two components to this tide gate presentation. I'm going to kick it off by just providing a little upfront framing. Then we'll transition to Maida, and she'll update you about the tide gate partnership work, and then we'll transition back to Ken and me to talk about priority next steps following the Oregon State University literature review that focused on tide gate removals and replacements that was presented to you at the January board meeting. So in terms of initial framing, OWEB's role in terms of tide gate investments. So one, you as a board invest in tide gate removals at times. And those removals are conducted for the purpose of either species and or water quality benefits. Second is you also fund tide gate replacements for those same species and water quality benefits, but essentially kind of two options there. You can fund the wholesale removal of a tide gate to support estuary and tidal restoration, or you may support replacement of a tide gate with a fish-friendly or more water quality responsive tide gate. As we think about the tide gate partnership, which Maida will talk with you about shortly, their focus, as you can see from the title, is squarely on tide gates, and it is on two types of replacements. One is for species and water quality benefits, so we do have an overlap in terms of OWEB's investment from that perspective. But the tide gate partnership that includes entities such as Oregon Farm Bureau, Cattlemen's Association, other landowner interest type representatives, is also interested in tide gate replacements for infrastructure benefits. So how can ag land behind a tide gate be protected through time to support the economic viability of an ag operation along the coast? So just wanted to flag that as we proceed through these two pieces of this agenda item, there are a couple different lenses that are coming into play. So in terms of the area of overlap between what you as a board invest in, what the tide gate partnership is focusing on, it really is that space of tide gate replacements for species and water quality benefits. So as we talk through the work that Maida and Jillian have been doing with the tide gate partnership, as Ken and I talk through next steps from the OSU literature review, you'll see some pieces where there's nice overlap and there's potential for partnership. You'll see some other areas that if you think about a Venn diagram, that OWEB may be over here more in the tide gate removal arena, and so that wouldn't be a fantastic area of overlap in terms of the tide gate partnership. So just wanted to do some of that upfront framing so we can get clear on where there is that overlap and then some pieces that might be sufficiently separate. So
For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, Executive Director. I'm going to refer you first to Attachment A in the staff report. Looks like this. Has a little picture of a tide gate on the side. And we do have some new folks. So just as a quick reminder, or if you haven't seen a tide gate before, we didn't have them when I was in Montana, so it was a new thing for me when I moved out here. A tide gate generally is used to control water in tidally influenced areas. So in other places of the state, we're desperately trying to get water onto the land. In tidally influenced areas, you're really trying to manage so it's on when you need it to keep your crops growing, your pasture growing, and off so that you're not walking your cattle around in 6, 12, 18 inches of mud. The way a tide gate works is if the tide is up, the tide gate is closed so that you're not pushing water into the system. When the tide goes out and there happens to be a creek behind, you want that gate to open so that the creek water doesn't flood the land either. So the goal is to keep this balance. The challenge with that is from the habitat perspective that Renee just mentioned, with older tide gates, it is closed, and as soon as that water pressure changes, the tide goes down, streams pushing against the side, it's a flood of water that goes out. So you got baby fish back there, they get flushed out. You've got big fish trying to get in, they can't get in. And so from a fish perspective, we care a lot about these tide gates, which is what started the Tide Gate Partnership. So we used to think it was, I used to say 1,000, then I started saying 1,500. Now I'm thinking in the thousands of tide gates up and down the Oregon coast. As they are replaced, they have a regulatory requirement under both the Department of Fish and Wildlife and NOAA Fisheries that those be replaced with fish-friendly tide gates where it makes sense. If there's no habitat at all, we still have to go through and check the box and say there was no habitat at all. But if there is a habitat benefit, then we have to look at how do we put in a fish-friendly tide gate and how do we have habitat behind. These are in many cases working farms and ranches. There's a reason there's a tide gate there. It is protecting farms, ranches, other infrastructure. So as Renee mentioned, the Tide Gate Partnership is focused on replacement with fish-friendly tide gates where it makes sense, but also moving the process forward where it doesn't make sense. And that partnership includes, if you look kind of 2/3 of the way down on Attachment A, it is landowners, state and federal agencies, agriculture organizations, counties, conservation organizations. So it's a pretty cool group. We have 50+ folks who are attending each of these meetings who are very passionate and keeping a very close eye on this process. I'm going to highlight for you briefly, as you see on the slide in front of you and in both the staff report and the attachment, the things that this group is working on. And as Renee said, some of them connect to the stuff that OWEB does, and some of them don't connect as directly, but in order to move the whole conversation forward, OWEB really feels like we need to be involved and at the table and helping to support this work. You have provided a grant as a part of the governor's priorities to help support the Tide Gate Partnership. So the areas, if you look at Attachment B to the staff report, one of the things that we did is, of course, because it's a process, we put together a partnership structure. The goal of this is to make sure that we're keeping our eye on the suite of balls that the partnership wants us to keep our eyes on. I'm going to talk through each of those items very briefly, but we just wanted you to understand that there's this whole suite of groups, including right now a regulatory group that I'll speak about in a minute, that are really trying to inform and expedite this conversation. The biggest challenge around tide gates, unlike culverts or bridges, the water in those instances is moving one way. It is way more difficult from an engineering perspective, from a fish perspective, when you've got water flowing two directions. So this has just been a really super tough nut to crack. So that Attachment B, I mentioned the partnership structure. This is the structure. I'm glad to answer any questions you have about that. The other thing that we've been doing is then focused on this set of areas, the outreach, inventory, et cetera. So from the outreach perspective, one of the first things we did, contracted or have a grant with the Association of Oregon Counties, who is serving as our neutral convener for this work. So they hosted a set of meetings last December in 4 communities along the coast. They were highly attended. So in Coquille, Tillamook in particular, there were 100+ landowners that came. And the goal, and it was tough, I'll say, for the agencies to sit and listen. The goal was just to let landowners come in and talk about their concerns and their fears and the issues that they're facing. We got a lot of great feedback from that. The nice thing is a lot of the feedback ties to what the partnership was already working on. We plan to go back out again this winter with another set of meetings that are going to be more focused on what have we done over the last year and what are the next steps moving forward. So we're going to keep touching bases with landowners. At the same time, we realize that in order to do anything about tide gates and to get this on the radar screen, and by the way, this ties into the larger water infrastructure conversation. Tide gates and levees are absolutely a part of water infrastructure. We don't have a clue how many there are. Like I mentioned, I used to think there was 1,000, and now I think there are thousands, but I don't actually know. So we have contracted with the Institute, or subcontracted with the Institute for Natural Resources, who is helping us put together a comprehensive inventory along the coast. They are taking data from folks like Coos and Coquille, who've done some great work, Tillamook and others, and are building a map that will spatially provide all of that information. We are finding a ton of errors in the data. There's a lot of piecework that needs to go into that. There are places where you see two next to each other that are probably one. We've run into issues around definition of what a tide gate is. So they are working on that. Our hope is to have that by the end of December, which is a pretty major lift for that group. But we're excited. I think that will change the shape of the conversation. That is not a condition analysis. That is just saying, here they are, and here's who we think owns them. Because the other thing that we found is, because they were built 100 years ago, people don't know who owns some of these things. There's an assumption if it's under a state highway that ODOT owns it, but ODOT doesn't. And so there's a lot I think we're going to find out in the inventory. Second, the next piece is the what we're calling the decision support tool. This is really more about funders. And this is a way for us to prioritize, I'm not supposed to use the prioritization word, but it really is, a way for local organizations and funders to look at where are the most important tide gates. And our hope is that they'll be able to do that based on what the funder is interested in. So as Renee mentioned, we care about fish and wildlife habitat. The goal is to develop a tool that would pop to the top those projects that have a high fish and wildlife habitat benefit for us. Whereas for somebody like NRCS, it may pop to the top only those tide gates that have farm or ranch land behind, because they don't necessarily care about the ones that don't. If we get federal infrastructure funding, we would want to pop to the top those things that are protecting infrastructure, like the city of Warrenton. So that's our hope. This has not been designed before. Nature Conservancy has been great in helping us out because they have one that prioritizes, optimizes fish and wildlife habitat already. So we're trying to figure out if we can add some of those other evaluative tools in. The next piece is the regulatory toolbox. We have been meeting constantly with our friends at Department of Fish and Wildlife and NOAA Fisheries to really figure out how we can streamline the regulatory approach, both in terms of how do we make the process easier for landowners, how do we make it feel like one process even though ultimately there are 4 agencies, ODF&W, NOAA, National Marine Fisheries Service, the Corps of Engineers, and Department of State Lands. How do we make it feel like one process for landowners? How do we expedite those things that have low habitat value and really focus on the ones that have high habitat value? We are bringing in the Corps and Department of State Lands into our next meeting, which is next week. We have not yet started on the engineering toolbox, but we think there are some really cool engineering solutions that might be out there. What we've decided to do is wait until we've figured out the regulatory piece first, so engineers know what they are designing to in terms of standards. And then, of course, we continue, and you heard this in our projects yesterday, we continue to fund on-the-ground projects. So this is we are not stopping our work on tide gates while we are focused on fixing the process, really making it streamlined. My biggest concern in this case is that because the process is so onerous right now, and because we don't have options for, big options for funding, we don't have big options for engineering, that there's probably a lot of landowners falling through the cracks who have a tide gate that fails. And when that tide gate fails, you've got to fix it immediately, because otherwise your farm is going to fail. And so if we can't get this process to a place where that's quick and easy for a landowner to come in, I worry that we also lose fish benefit in the process, because they're going to replace it with something that isn't fish friendly, just trying to keep their farm going. And we don't want to have landowners be at that decision point. So, do you want to go through yours and then we'll open it up? Sure. Okay. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, co-chairs, members of the board, Ken Fetcho, Effectiveness Monitoring Coordinator. So this portion of this agenda item is an opportunity for us to provide an update on the next steps from the literature review report that we had OSU help provide. And that was on in coordination with the board's monitoring subcommittee. So over the last 2 years, we have identified tidegate restoration investments as a priority area for programmatic effectiveness monitoring.
Real quick, Ken, I just want to point out it's behind the blue sheet in your binders. I noticed people were looking for it. So thank you.
Thank you. That's agenda item M2. And so when we use the term tidegate restoration, we're referring to tidegate removal and tidegate replacement. It's just a general term that we can use to refer to both. And, removal of tidegates tend to be much more larger and include larger scale sort of coastal wetland restoration that meet many goals and objectives, and while tidegate replacement tends to be really focusing on improving the function of that gate, but implementing, as we heard earlier, more fish-friendly design so the fish can hopefully access the upstream habitats and have a better sort of water quality exchange. Those are the types of projects that OWEB is interested in funding. And so as we saw in that project that Mark Grandhammer highlighted in Region 2, that these tidegate replacement projects are very costly and complex, okay? And in addition, as we heard from Maida, there's many natural resource experts out there that are very concerned about the aging infrastructure, but also what that means for identifying tidegate restoration projects that OWEB is interested in, okay? And so due to these emerging issues, we worked with the OWEB monitoring subcommittee and all of you guys to identify and compile existing information related to these restoration projects, not only in Oregon, but across the Pacific Northwest. And this tidegate literature review helped compile information not only like what was occurred on the ground, but also various monitoring efforts that complemented those restoration projects. And so in January of 2018, we presented with OSU, we presented those findings of that literature review, and that included, findings, lessons learned, and also sort of recommendations from the author's point of view of what some next steps were. And that document is quite extensive, and that's on our website. We have the link there, and it's also the executive summary would have been provided in your January board book, and that's available online in the staff report as well.
For the record, Renee Davis. So here's a copy of the executive summary. The full document is about 300 pages. OSU did a fantastic job in getting really that range of findings and lessons learned from around the region. I think all told there were 70-some different findings and recommendations. So we, in coordination with the monitoring subcommittee, have spent some time in the last several months really digesting those and determining which pieces, if we think back to that Venn diagram, are within OWEB's realm, which pieces might we partner with others, such as the Tidegate Partnership, but not only limited to them, to move ahead, and maybe which pieces, for example, could be outside of our realm. So there were some suggestions that as part of the statewide land use use planning process, we should really think differently about comprehensive estuarine restoration. That was one of the findings or recommendations in the OSU Lit Review. That's a bit beyond our purview, so just wanted to be sensitive as we review the findings or recommendations, initially as staff and then in coordination with the monitoring subcommittee, of putting them into different kind of bins and categories of areas that we could tackle, areas that we might need to do some legwork and coordination with others on. So, and you'll see in the staff report, we went through a categorization process in looking at those recommendations. So focused on initially which recommendations and findings were around planning for tidegate restoration projects, which focused more squarely on implementation, which were more focused on monitoring. There's definitely a big need for additional and more robust monitoring information about how these projects are performing through time. And then which pieces fell more into the communication vein, if you will. Huge thanks to the monitoring subcommittee who sorted through a lot of that during the last phone conversation and helped us really identify 3 key priority next steps for essentially the next year or so, but knowing that some of this could move forward beyond 12 months. So one is to develop a document that really does a nice job of compiling the lessons learned about tidegate restoration projects and some of those considerations for folks who are contemplating or already in the midst of undertaking tidegate replacement or removal projects. So the key audience there is really targeting restoration practitioners and review teams. The OSU Literature Review provides a wealth of information on this subject. What we are intending to focus some time on as staff, and going to Molly's question yesterday about how are we capturing lessons learned? Are we able to package those up and put it into folks' hands? So maybe thinking this could be one document, it could be multiple documents that really do capture some of the more deep technical details that emerge from the OSU work and that we're finding from some of the monitoring that we're supporting, as an example, but also maybe a companion document that could be a more kind of quick and easy accessible guide for those folks who are on the ground faced with planning and contemplating design around tidegate restoration projects. So really some of those technical tools, if you will, certainly for restoration practitioners, but also for review teams. The OSU Literature Review did a great job of highlighting, here are some technical considerations and maybe some criteria that you might consider as you're weighing projects that are coming in the door and that the board's considering for funding. So that's definitely an area of focus for us in terms of a priority next step. The second piece in this one, we did identify as being a nice opportunity to dovetail with some of the work of the Tidegate Partnership. In the OSU Literature Review, they flagged a number of efforts around the region that have ventured into some of these conversations earlier than we have in a more coordinated fashion. So for example, I always turn the name around, the Farm, Fish, and Flood Initiative that the state of Washington's involved with. I think NOAA has been a key partner in that. And then also there's some interesting hydrodynamic modeling work that's happened elsewhere. And so really trying to have a coordinated effort to learn more about what others have found and maybe some of the either skinned knees that they could share with us in terms of lessons learned that we could learn from, and also maybe some tools that we might be able to import into Oregon as we're contemplating some of the design and engineering, just as an example on some of the tidegate projects. So certainly in terms of audience, that would include restoration practitioners and review teams. Also in some cases, it could involve landowners answering some of the questions and responding to some of the concerns that have come up in the Tidegate Partnership conversations, and that I think it's attachment C and Maida's portion of the staff report outlines, some areas that landowners really want some help or support with. And so really trying to tap into some of those regional efforts elsewhere. And then obviously doing this in coordination with the Tidegate Partnership. They would be an audience for this. And then the third area of focus for us in the coming year around next steps from the Tidegate work with OSU is primarily in coordination with agency partners and local partners, really exploring opportunities to better invest or differently invest in monitoring of tide gates. We have done some monitoring. We've supported some monitoring of the tide gate investments that this board has made. We can certainly draw upon some work that others in the state have done to monitor some of the work that ODFW has done, for example. But we do not have a robust set of information in terms of how these projects have performed. Not suggesting that we will build in a requirement to monitor each and every tide gate project that's ever implemented, but really working with agency and local partners to determine what is that kind of sample design that we might want to consider as projects, as new type gate projects are coming online. How can we get out there, have a subset that are sampled, have the necessary baseline or preliminary data, and then have a game plan for tracking and monitoring those through time, so we really understand how different projects, particularly at different scales, perform, and some of the different design criteria that are used. One project that I know, at least those who've been around a little bit longer, familiar with, is Winter Lake. That's been a big investment by this board and many others. We do have monitoring set up for that project. We don't expect every tide gate project to look like Winter Lake. We certainly hope that's not the case because it's been incredibly expensive, but making sure that we don't just focus monitoring on those incredibly expensive and complicated projects, ensuring that we're also looking at projects that maybe are somewhat simpler, but that there may be a lot more of coming in the door through time. And so certainly, again, in terms of audience restoration practitioners and review teams would be consumers of that type of monitoring information. So thanks again to the monitoring subcommittee for your work on this. It's really great to have a collection of folks to bounce some of the more technical details off of and ensure that we're providing the right types of next steps and tools and guidance for our partners on the ground, but also being considerate of staff workload. So thanks for your collaboration on that. So happy to take questions.
Gary, and then Liza Jane and Laura.
It's Gary. So what a big and important project this is, and I'm just really commend you for doing all this hard work on this, because it seems to me, and I didn't know anything about a tide gate until this, we took on this one funding piece. But is there other, have we helped install other tide gates, and what are the lessons learned from some of that from our position?
Yeah, so the report that we, as Ken Fetcho, Effectiveness Monitoring Coordinator, the report does lay out really clearly those projects that OWEB has invested in both removal and replacements. And I don't quite remember the exact numbers, but we have invested in more removal projects than replacement projects. It's something about, and we looked back specifically over the last 10 years where we had really good information on those projects. And it's something like 10 removal projects and about 6 replacement projects. And so when they compiled lessons learned, they also included projects, though, across the Pacific Northwest, including Washington and Northern California, and really trying to make the emphasis that MEDA made was not all tide gates are equal. There are some, and really you want to understand where that tide gate is in relation to the watershed. So some are at the mouths of pretty large streams. Some are on tributaries, and some just drain fields. And not all of those areas are good places for OWEB to invest in, because there may not be really valuable habitat upstream, and you're not getting a really large bang for your buck. And so that's one lesson learned that I really took from that. And there was a nice schematic in the report that sort of showed that how those, where they're located in the watershed and how much habitat is upstream that you need to keep in mind before you start considering investing in a tide gate. Another one is really the design considerations. So some of these lessons learned are really important in understanding sort of the geometry of the channel and just how the slope of that stream and where you put that tide gate and how far you sit that down in the bed and how large that opening is. All those things are going to have a role in velocities and the ability for fish to pass that gate, but also the way in which freshwater and saltwater exchanges. And so the design considerations are really important in the effects that are going to have to fish and water quality. So those are just two that I could think of off the top of my head from reading that report.
Liza Jane. Laura.
Laura Masterson. So remind me, obviously OWEB is funding the monitoring, but is there a single place where it's kind of all housed or collected or analyzed, or how is that working?
For the record, Renee Davis. So we are funding some of the monitoring. There's definitely other monitoring that's happening out there, but if you use Winter Lake as an example, we are a primary funder for that work. The data story is not necessarily, the answer you're going to hear is not necessarily the one you want to hear. So if the information is about, if it's biological data, so say fish surveys, that information, we require our grantees to submit to Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife so that we have it in a repository. For water quality data, that's required to be submitted to Department of Environmental Quality, who we were talking at dinner last night, has recently stood up an updated version of their water quality database. So that's great news. But that does not necessarily guarantee that all of the necessary pieces will be integrated to be able to tell that story. That is something that with a monitoring investment like Winter Lake, we have worked hard to think about the reporting requirements for those, so the necessary analyses are done. But not all of the monitoring that's happening has that same type of analysis and reporting, and that's part of what the message was from OSU. We need a more standardized structure for some of this monitoring information to ensure that it is analyzed, it's compiled, and the findings are shared. So that's definitely something on our minds.
Yeah, I would just say that my name is Ken Fetcho. I'm the Effectiveness Monitoring Coordinator, for the record. And so one thing to keep in mind is that data is also housed by the grantee, so whoever's leading that effort to do that monitoring. And so, for instance, there was a large removal project, Nyleston, and Institute for Applied Ecology was the main lead on that, and so they synthesize all that data and have produced reports, and so it sort of just depends on the monitoring effort, but that while we do require them to share that data with the different agencies that Renee described, there is still the main monitoring entity that houses that information and has worked it up and used it for their needs that they described in that monitoring application.
Yeah, Laura Masterson. I think part of the reason I asked the question is because I feel like I'm also seeing this in other parts of monitoring where required to submit doesn't get you necessarily the analysis that you want or make that analysis accessible to everyone else who needs to use it. So I would just encourage the monitoring committee, you guys are all nodding, so to keep working on that, because I think it's amazing how much how much funding now is going towards monitoring, but that's the bottleneck, at least that I'm seeing, and you're all nodding, so great, thank you.
It's in our strategic plan because nobody has figured it out yet.
That was Maida Lofsgarden.
For the record.
Liza Jane, did you have a?
I do. Liza Jane, for the record. Backing up, this group's been in place for a year?
For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, two kind of different groups. So the Tidegate Partnership has been in place, I would say, almost 2 years, or a little over 2 years now.
Okay.
The literature review that OWEB funded came out last January. So in the two pieces, that's about the length of time for each.
So my question and concern is, it says that the participants would reach out to tribes and other interested groups as a project. Has that occurred? Are they involved and included?
Yeah, for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, I would say a mix on that. So part of the initial outreach included connecting up with tribes. One of the challenges that we've had not in reaching out with tribes is that the biggest bottleneck that we've got right now is the regulatory bottleneck. So we've actually stepped back from a lot of the broad outreach so that we could really get the regulatory agencies in one room and start working through things. So there hasn't been a lot of things that we could come and deliver to tribes lately, but there is no question that that's part of the process. It's just kind of where we are in the process right now is a regrouping of the state and federal agencies so that we can get our house in order on the partnership side.
Jillian McCarthy did come and present to the Tribal Natural Resource Work Group. So there is this work group that is tribal natural resource departments that attend and state natural resource agencies. And Jillian came and gave a briefing on that and to, broadly describe what's happening and sort of asked tribes that are interested to sort of signal that they want to stay in the loop and continue to be informed as we move along. And so we did that.
Paul, and then Jason.
Yes, thank you, Paul Henson. So first of all, on that monitoring discussion, it seemed to me there's a tremendous opportunity for very straightforward applied research on that. Like you've got a lot of, like you said, collect a little baseline data, a lot of before and after treatment, but then you also probably got a lot of treatment and control, sort of, go in and fix and then leave it alone and compare. And it just seemed like a real natural bunch of master's theses or a few PhDs or something like that. I'm looking to kind of the academic folks, yeah, it's really, it's all set up. It's just super natural thing to do. So I strongly encourage that. And if Fish and Wildlife Service can help with that, we try and fund grad students and stuff on that sort of stuff. So.
Yeah, for the record, Renee Davis, thank you for that, Paul. That was definitely one of the recommendations from OSU, potentially self-servingly, because they're always looking for work for their grad students, but not in a bad way. I think that's where some of the rub comes is funding and being able to do that at scale. So thank you for that.
Okay. One other question, completely different, is I'm just curious. The incentive, obviously, for a landowner or producer to fix a failing tide gate is clear. You made that. What about, are there situations where a private landowner, there are tide gates failing, but they're not really operating in those lands and they don't really care? And what's their either liability or incentive? Are they accountable for that if they own that structure?
Yeah, for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, you just opened that really big can of worms, so thank you for that. I'm going to try and keep it, but it's a really interesting conversation. So from one end, yes, there's the need to replace where that land is still actively being managed. And like I mentioned before, there are places where there are tide gates that exist out there that the landowner who buys the land doesn't even know that there's a tide gate operating on their place. There are drainage districts that may not necessarily know that they're a member of the drainage district. So there's a lot of funkiness. And the challenge comes in that is a couple of fold. If, for example, you've got a property that is no longer being managed as a pasture and the tide gate is failing, the challenge is the surrounding infrastructure. So it's not just a tide gate, it's also a series of levees, right? And so the tide gate fails, and what you end up doing is potentially trapping fish behind because they get in and they can't get back out. You end up with mosquito problems. I don't know if you've heard about Bandon. And so the challenge is it gets really funky because I've had a lot of, and this is not your question, but I've had conservation groups in the past say, why are we funding this? Let's just let them fail. Well, one is we've got a farm economy that is really important and we really want to support. But in those cases, like you're talking about, a tide gate failing does not turn it back to a natural system. It turns it into a weedy mess that traps fish and has poor water quality and potential mosquitoes. And so we're in this really interesting space where this is an infrastructure component that's been created over the last 150 years so that we could have communities, we could have roads, we could have industry in an area, and that over time we have to either actively manage to keep it there or actively manage to remove it, which is a unique situation, I think, for tide gates.
Jason?
Great. Jason Robinson for the record. So I wanted to follow up with a comment that Liza Jane had made about tribes, and there are 3 tribes in particular that are really focused in on those tidal basins right now, and that's the Coquel, the Coos Lorum, Kwasayusla, and the Siletz. So they are either currently involved in projects. I know the Coquel is involved in Winter Lakes. Coos has been actively involved in doing inventories on the Coos system, as well as looking into Sayusla. And then you've got the Siletz, who have been involved up and down the coast in monitoring efforts. So, they're very much involved, and we definitely want to keep them in the queue as we move forward. The other question I had is, as you look at tide gates across, these geographic areas, we already mentioned this, a tide gate's not a tide gate's not a tide gate. They're all different. But also, if you look at the habitats, the riverine habitats with those, they're all different as well. So you look at the Coquille, for example, we talked about it yesterday. It's the second largest tidally influenced basins in Oregon, next to the Columbia. It acts completely different than the Rogue, which is very short. And so as you look at those things, how has the research kind of looked at geographic differences, and is there an opportunity there for us to look at those? And then as a follow-up to that, some of the anecdotal information we're seeing come out of the Coquille system, which is very tidally influenced, is that we're seeing significant production in juvenile coho, not just in the production and quantity, but the size of those fish moving out as a result of projects that are happening in the Coquille system. And that's a system that's unique in that it is very tidally influenced, but it is really a coho system. So just curious how, if there's opportunities there for us, or how the research is showing geographic changes or changes between systems.
So for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, I'm not going to answer your question, but I'm going to answer a piece of it and then turn it over to Ken and Renee. So the one piece I want to speak to is actually the pre-research, and that is, you're absolutely right. A tide gate is not a tide gate is not a tide gate, and yet I would say from a regulatory perspective, we've largely treated them as a tide gate is a tide gate is a tide gate. And one of the great aha moments we've had in working with ODF&W and NOAA is it's a very different conversation with a landowner if you have a property that is saltwater tidally influenced versus freshwater. Freshwater, Winter Lake, they'll let it flood in the winter, right? It's fine. It's 1,700 acres of a lake in the winter. If that was saltwater, there is no way that those landowners would let that property be inundated with saltwater. So even beyond the research, what we're finding is, and it's a hard conversation to have with a landowner, is that it is so specific to where it sits and the size of the tributary, how far up, like the Coquille, you're 30 plus miles up and you're still tidally influenced. So there's a lot that goes in, even just from the perspective of where do we focus our time and energy, and how do we have conversations differently with landowners in these different systems as well. I'll let Ken speak to the research side.
Yeah, I think that when I think about the findings and the different monitoring efforts they highlight in that literature review report, it is really geographic specific, and that it's hard to generalize across the given coastline, either Oregon or Washington or even Northern California, and it is often species specific too. So they're really clear. Like we studied Chinook, or we studied coho, and those findings, and they were careful to not broadly generalize that those findings are going to apply everywhere. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Jason, for the record, yeah, it does, and I think there's tremendous opportunity there as well as we think about OWEB's capacity for monitoring and looking at monitoring design specifically on tide gates. That there's a lot of information that still needs to be gathered out there and with our project partners. So.
Yeah, for the record, Renee Davis, I think that's exactly true. The OSU piece did a nice job of that appropriate geographic parsing, but I think it's a question of scale. We simply don't have enough data points in some of these cases, and I think as we're considering what a monitoring structure or framework might look like for this, there's the how does the design itself perform, but then there's the longer term, what are the condition of the fish coming out? I mean, not just production, but what's the condition of these fish across these different systems? So there are a lot of different overlays in terms of that sample design for us to keep in mind as we're proceeding forth with that third recommendation.
Any last questions or comments from the board? Yeah, Rosemary.
Rosemary Furphy, thank you very much. I'm interested in timing of these different products. I think these are very important in highlighting. I assume most of them will be done in-house. Are you thinking about that? And then I'm particularly interested in the second bullet, Tidegate efforts elsewhere. And I'm thinking it would be very important to hear, very interesting to hear how the Washington Salmon Recovery Board, the state of Washington in particular, is approaching this. And lessons learned, are they a few years ahead of us? Are they just beginning this effort? I think it's just critically important to learn from these other efforts and potentially in California as well, but I'm thinking Washington, and particularly as we look at our partner agency in Washington, and wondering when we might hear from you on those.
So for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, I'll speak to the second one. And on that piece, Rosemary, you're right. It's actually really interesting because the state of Washington has been joining our phone calls because in some places we're ahead of them. And so they've been participating, just listening in on our Tidegate calls. The place where we see that there is a difference is in the Farm Fish and Flood Initiative that's up in the Skagit Valley. And we hear varying reports, but this one has come up in numerous times in numerous places. So we will be actually working with the Association of Counties to bring them down to have a conversation. So that'll happen through the Tidegate Partnership, but will feed this other conversation. And I can't necessarily give you a time frame, but I think Renee's right that as we look at all three of these things, these are the things we're talking about over the next year doing. We don't have a specific win just because of some of the other things we're working on, but that one for us is one that we want to catch in the real near future, and really appreciate Washington because we're trying to provide feedback both ways in that conversation.
For the record, Renee Davis, and I'll be brief because I know we're over time. So on the first piece, certainly great in-house opportunity, especially now that Lisa is on board for that compilation of lessons learned and considerations. So that I expect certainly will be done, in the next 6 months probably. Second piece, obviously, in partnership with the Tidegate Partnership. The third piece could take a bit more time because I think around the monitoring conversations, we need to, going back to Jason's point just before this, we need to be thinking about what are those various design considerations, monitoring design considerations we should be contemplating. And we want to do that well in coordination, I think, with our agency and local partners, and then potentially tee up some type of funding request for the board under programmatic effectiveness monitoring. So that may take a little bit more lead time, but certainly we'll kick it off within the next 12 months and maybe even have a request in.
All right, thank you all. We'll move to the next item.
All right, we're going to be moving to agenda item N, Conservation Partnership, and Courtney's going to come up and set the stage for that. And so if we have any specific public comment on that, we'll get that to Derica, and then after Courtney sets the stage, we'll move to public comment.
Working through logistics. Okay, for the record, Courtney Schaff, Capacity Programs Coordinator, just working through the logistics here. What we are going to do is I'm going to give a very brief overview of the Conservation Partnership and why we've asked them to come, why we're asking the board to take action on their funding today. Then, because they personally can speak much better to their accomplishments and their plans than I can, even though I read all the progress reports they submit, we've asked them to come up as part of public comment and provide an overview of what they have done, and then we'll come back and deliberate and discuss and ask for your decision. So to put it in context for all of our board members, the Conservation Partnership, has been mentioned a few times, includes the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils, the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts, Ocean, and the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts. So these entities work together as the Oregon Conservation Partnership, delivering services to their stakeholders who are our grantees across the state to help our local stakeholders develop capacity in order to engage with their communities and get work done on the ground. So the board has been funding these entities in a variety of different mechanisms all the way back since 2007. And then starting a few biennia ago, we began investing one grant per biennium into the Oregon Conservation Partnership and funding the collective work of these organizations versus the individual work of any of the organizations. So they all still do operate individually and have individual accomplishments, but what the OWEB board has been investing in is their collective work and their collective accomplishments to work for all of their stakeholders. So back in July, when the board adopted its spending plan and took action, they delegated funds, and we entered into a grant agreement with the Conservation Partnership for $450,000, which is an increase from previous biennia. And what the board decided at that time was that you wanted a visual progress report. So we do get quarterly progress reports from the Conservation Partnership, but you wanted them to come and give you a presentation, what they've been up to and the work that they have done before you take action to award the rest of the funds. So that's what we are doing here today, of asking them to come give a report on the work they've been doing, what they're planning on doing the rest of the biennium, and then we'll ask the board to take action on those remaining funds. So before I invite them up to talk about what they've done and give you an opportunity to ask them questions, any questions for me?
Questions for Courtney? No.
Great.
Perfect.
All right.
All right, so we have Kelly Beamer, Kelly T, Terry R, and Anna. The Conservation Partnership.
Let's see. So, good morning. For the record, my name is Kelly Beamer. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts. And as you can see from the logos, we are one of the 4 organizations that is part of the Oregon Conservation Partnership. Appreciate the opportunity for us to come here to the beautiful South Coast and give you a little update about what we've been up to over the last biennium. As Courtney said, you all have made a big investment in this partnership, and I'm excited because we have about 10 or 15 minutes to share what I feel like are big results. This last biennium, there was an increase of funding commitment because COLT became the newest formal addition to the partnership. And now the groups that are before you today represent over 150 organizations implementing on-the-ground voluntary conservation in Oregon. They are the constituents that are doing the work. And so we have quite a community between the boards that serve in all of our organizations and the staffs that we represent. And also exciting is you see a lot of new faces today representing the partnership. John Keith and Jason and Sean are not all available to be here today. But I think it shows the depth of the partnership that these board members have stepped up and are here, and there's even new staff. So it's kind of an exciting moment in time to come present to you today. All of the executive directors, we meet monthly. We talk about our shared work plan that we've taken on. And what really guides our work are 4 overarching areas of shared work. Number 1, communications and awareness. Number 2, professional education and networking. And then number 3, government relations. And number 4, collaboration, conservation planning. And so we have a really distinct MOU that helps sort of put the framework of a work plan in place, and then we get to roll up our sleeves and go out and do it. And so what we're going to do is just take about 2 minutes each and go down the line here and share a little bit with you about what we have accomplished in the last year and a half or so. So with that, I am going to pass it on to Terry. You might want to pull that mic down.
Hi, my name's Terry Prieg-Rigsby, and I'm the Vice President of the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts. I'm also Board Chair of the West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District and Executive Director of the Trine Creek Watershed Council. So I've had the benefit of being in and around this work for about 17 years. So hopefully I can bring some historic perspective, but I am relatively new in the OECD role, so thanks for having us here today. So as you know, the purpose of the partnership is to support each other and our constituents so we can function better than what we could do alone. I don't think anything is quite as illustrative of our success as our Connect conference. As a Soil and Water Conservation District Director for over a dozen years, I've attended many of these conferences, and I can say with confidence that the past 2 years have really seen a tremendous improvement in the quality of the breakout sessions, the field trips, and even our keynote speakers. This year, we hosted over 300 environmental professionals from every corner of the state. We provided nearly 70 workshops with over 100 speakers across several categories. And these included skill-based training on topics such as Oregon white oak habitat restoration and gray water to green landscaping. We had a series of innovative approaches workshops, such as utilizing data with the Oregon Explorer program, reducing farm risk through integrated biological pest management, and we were lucky to have a very hands-on workshop with the NRCS Soil Health Demonstration Trailer. So thank you for that. Of course, we also offered a whole host of workshops to support our watershed councils, our soil and water conservation districts, and our land trusts with workshops on leadership skills, board and employee management, fiscal health, and education and outreach. So we made all of these materials available on our website, so anyone that did attend that conference or those that were not able to could access all of this technical and very relevant information. And since the overall goal of our partnership here is to improve our overall functionality and build high-functioning partnerships, I think you can recognize that our conference here was an opportunity for us to network and build those relationships while also developing our skills. So, we had about 40 volunteers and received very high evaluation for the quality of the workshops and programming that we offered. Also, I want to point out that we did offer scholarships, so people who were not able to attend on their own, maybe their organizations couldn't afford a couple of days at the coast, working on these getting this educational opportunities, we were able to support them, so spreading the resources across the state. And like I said, we received really high evaluation, and that included, here's one quote. So I can't underscore enough how important the network aspect of the conference was for me being a new executive director. So I feel like that was a sentiment shared across most of our participants. So very effective use of our funding.
On to webinars.
For the record, Kelly Timchak. Been wanting to say that for days now. So as the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils, part of our duties for this grant is to deliver a series of webinars. So there were 19 webinars that were delivered, and this is to anyone. Anyone can clue into these. It can be agencies, it can be watershed councils, districts, land trusts, or anybody from the public that's interested. So there's been about 600 participants total for this program, and there's usually about 30 people on each webinar. They're wide spanning, even Ken Fetcho's used one for doing online monitoring applications, so there was a tutorial for doing OWEB applications, and we had about 50 participants for that one as well. So it's kind of used by all of us, which is great. One quote I'll give here, and these are monthly webinars. We do these on the third Thursday of every month. After this morning's webinar, I am optimistic that we can finally operate more efficiently and better serve our constituents with a well-functioning system that allows for optimal record keeping and data management. So, like I said, some of these are technical, some of them are not, but they've been quite beneficial for our constituents. And so over the next several months, this is kind of what we've got queued up. November 1st, there's a conservation loan program webinar that's going to be coming on. We'll have a Tidegate update, and that will come from Mel Dunn, who was here yesterday from the Coquille. We've got a low-impact development that has a lot to do with stormwater management. So if you guys are interested, or if you know of any of your constituents that are interested in these, pass it along. We've got seeing our work through climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. Amy Steiner is going to be doing a great Beaver Analog Dam presentation on one of the webinars as well. And then John Souter will be delivering a zero-stage restoration webinar. And again, as Terry mentioned, all these are actually sort of just like Connect. These are all recorded and then also uploaded online. So anybody that can't make it to the webinar, or if they want to forward a link to their friend, this is all accessible. So we also see this as like we're growing an online library, you know, and a repository for future coordinators and directors to come and access this information as well.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. And something that's been exciting and new about this last year in the partnership is we've had the ability to bring on a PR consultant. This is a woman, Natalie Bennon. She presented at Connect and did an opening talk about how you pitch a story. But in essence, you know, we're all concerned about engaging with more Oregonians. We're concerned about ensuring that conservation stays relevant in a pretty rapidly changing world that we're in, and also elevating the stories that our members are doing on an everyday basis, because we know they're working hard, we know they're accomplishing incredible things, you all saw yesterday, but that second step of putting your head up and sending a press release, you know, that's not necessarily second nature for a lot of our members, calling and nurturing relationships with reporters. So Natalie is an expert in this and has come on board and really helped us see the benefits of doing that outreach, that those press releases, those story pitches, and has helped us tremendously. And so over the last year, through that investment, we've been able to secure 34 articles about the work that our members are doing. And that also includes programs run on evening news. A personal victory was we had Eugene radio or TV cams out on the Upper McKinsey, and they used the word ecosystem in the evening news. Like, how often does that happen? So all in all, it's been this way to really reach a significant, broader constituency than we could on our own, coming together. And again, in these monthly meetings, we share with Natalie, you know, what's happening in the field. Wow, what would create an amazing story? If you think back to when the Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Fund was on the chopping block at one point with this administration, we had these voices come out of the woodwork. Bill Monroe, you know, the hunting and fishing editor for the Oregonian, wrote an incredibly impassioned op-ed. We had a Klamath tribal biologist partner with the Watershed Council to write a joint op-ed. We had these voices popping up all over the state, and really, with Natalie's support, she's helping, I would say, kind of institutionalize this work for our members that, again, is second nature. So this is something new that, again, has been a huge lift and has been a real win for the partners involved. Another piece of engaging more people in our shared plan is we do tours on the land for elected officials. So these are city council members, county commissioners, state legislators, and representative from the federal delegation. And in this last grant period, we've done 3 a summer. I believe, Paul, you came out on one at Aspen Valley Ranch 2 summers ago, Jim Woods Ranch. But this is an opportunity, as you all know, there's nothing like hearing from a landowner talk from their heart about why they are committing to conservation on their land. And that can go far beyond anything we can say or even our members can say. So this is an opportunity for landowners to share with elected officials. And ultimately, these are our leaders in the state that are, you know, approving these budgets and need to have that contact with the projects in the field. So this is a picture of County Commissioner Mark Bennett leading a tour this past summer on his ranch. So over the grant period, we've had about 6 tours with 120 participants, elected officials from all levels of the government, agency partners. And then it's kind of fun when you have, you know, state representative retweeting the tour pictures that they had captured on that day. So that's been an exciting way to collaborate. And every one of the projects we visited show this partnership dynamic and have that highlighted as a piece of the work. So I'm going to pass it to Anna to talk about government relations.
For the record, I'm Anna Freitas. I'm the new Policy and Program Manager at the Oregon Association of of Conservation Districts. It's been really wonderful joining this team. I'm impressed with the work they've done. So through these communication efforts that my partners have mentioned, and through further coordination and communication between the 4 conservation partners, we've garnered the representational power to increase awareness and support for voluntary conservation. These collaborative accomplishments have fortified the statewide reach and presence of the conservation community in Oregon, and we aim to continue doing so. The improved working relationship between the partners helps us communicate with each other, our members, and other partners about challenges and opportunities happening at multiple levels. Whether it's something on-the-ground staff come across while they're implementing conservation practices, or tracking relevant state and federal policies like OAHP or the Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Fund. Together, we're able to inform each other and to educate and inform our members. For instance, we've drafted a government relations toolkit that will inform our members about how they can best communicate with decision makers. The toolkit includes information on what they are and aren't allowed to do when it comes to lobbying and informing policymakers, and the best ways to connect and communicate with government officials and media, such as those land tours and press coverage. The toolkit also includes resources for how to learn about and weigh in on policy, tips for communication on multiple platforms, and links to ways to track and learn about policy. With that, I think Kelly has a conclusion.
Thanks, Anna. So yeah, we're busy, and on top of that, we're all doing our own, kind of wearing our own hats and supporting the things that come up with our own constituents as well. But it's definitely broadened my horizons and perspectives to be working in this partnership and getting to know and build friends in the district world and the watershed world, and I think we're stronger because of it. So I want to thank you for investing in this partnership. Without your investment, all of this would not have happened or been possible. I want to respectively request for your continued support because we're just getting started. And the Voice of Conservation has an important role in the state of Oregon, and it's a real honor to be working on behalf of it. So we feel like we're not only supporting our base, but reaching more Oregonians through this partnership. So thank you so much for all that you've done on our behalf, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, before we get to questions, this is Jason Robinson. Just wanted to remind folks that Courtney will be coming back up to actually work through the agenda items. So let's just keep all the questions related to the presentation. Thanks. Any questions? Ron?
Just Ron Alvarado with NRCS. Just a comment and a big thank you. NRCS, you know, we are very engaged in this partnership, and I would say 85 to 90% of my employees are in field offices sitting right next to the partnership. And I can tell you the value that this partnership brings to our delivery system, right, to private lands conservation. So just a big thank you on our part, and fully support the partnership.
Other questions? I did have a comment about the Connect conference, and I got an opportunity to work with Ken Fetcho, who facilitated the Working Effectively with Tribes, and we had just a phenomenal crowd right before lunch, and I think we went about 15 to 20 minutes over into lunch. People wanted to stay and listen and hear from the panel, so just an exceptional opportunity to get folks together, and I really appreciate that event, so thank you. Other questions or comments? All right, thank you very much. Courtney.
For the record, Courtney Schaff, Capacity Programs Coordinator. So now see if the board has any additional questions for me about this request, and then I guess get a feel for the board, and the action will be taken on Friday.
Other
I
questions?
think the partnership spoke clearly for themselves, that they've been working hard, and And I know from experience that all of their third Thursday webinars are filled because we have ideas occasionally that we float by them and they're like, well, 6 months out, we can run that for you.
Any other questions for Courtney? And then we'll do just a straw vote, and our official vote will be on Friday. Okay, so just looking at the motion that will be coming up on Friday, it would be to add an additional $50,000 to the Conservation Partnership and OWEB grant number 218-8006-15907 for a total award of $500,000 for the biennium. So if we can just get a show of hands of those voting members, of those that would be in favor of this, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so unanimous.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, now we're moving to, Will Newhouser for the record, we're moving to the governor's priorities, item number O, or item letter O in your notebook. Eric Williams. 2 Erics.
The Erics.
Good morning, Mr. Co-Chairs, members of the board. For the record, Eric Hartstein, Senior Policy Coordinator. We're going to actually separate this agenda item into 2 separate requests. I'll cover the first request, and Grant Program Manager Williams will cover the second. So I will bring your attention, we're on item O, and this will be talking, I'll be referencing the staff report that is with the subject line agenda item O, and Eric will be referencing the staff report, which is in your blue folder, which is agenda item O2. So as I'm sure you all know, this past summer there was catastrophic wildfires in north central Oregon that impacted over 300,000 acres in Wasco, Sherman, and Gillum counties. The soil and water conservation districts in those counties have responded quickly and have partnered with local, state, and federal agencies to address the damage caused by the fires, which includes burned fencing, riparian, loss of riparian and upland vegetation, and the real potential for soil erosion on both crop and rangeland. Attachment A to the staff report provides a brief summary of some of the larger fires that occurred in the region, and you'll see some of which burned very close to critical habitat for ESA-listed fish. These fires occurred on both public and private land, and on federal land, burned area emergency response teams are mobilized to assess damage and implement actions to help minimize damage from wildfires. And while Oregon does not have a similar program on private lands, OWEB does have a history of responding to natural disasters. And you'll find in your blue folders a memo from Jason Miner with the Governor's Natural Resource Office requesting the board approve funding from the Governor's priority line item in the spending plan for post-fire technical assistance in Wasco, Sherman, and Gillum counties. And this technical assistance funding will be for up to $60,000 and will support the soil and water conservation districts in engaging landowners and their partners in assessing the damage that has occurred on private lands, doing some GIS mapping and analysis to develop plans and prioritize further action, and ultimately help direct landowners to the appropriate funding sources to implement restoration actions to minimize some of the fire damage that occurred. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions on this request.
Alan.
Alan Henning for the record. Eric, do you know how that money would be dispersed? I mean, we've got 3 or 4 counties hit pretty hard. How many SWCDs would that be dispersed to? How is that going to be handled? You've got some ideas of how the money's going to be spent, but who's going to be receiving the benefit of that?
Thank you, Alan. For the record, Eric Hartstein. We received responses from 3 SWCDs. We expect, in order to minimize some of the administrative work, they would have 1 grant agreement that would go to Wasco County, the Wasco County SWCD, and the other districts would then be billing to Wasco SWCD.
Other questions or comments on this portion? Laura?
Laura Masterson. I just want to say that we heard a lot about this at our last ODA board meeting, and I think this fire season seems like it had a much larger impact on agricultural producers, just the way the fires went through some of those lands in Wasco County. I mean, usually our fire seasons are in the forested areas, and a large part of these fires were across cropland. So I really appreciate OWEB and the governor's office innovating to try and figure out how to help farmers who aren't usually in this position of needing assistance for fires. So anyway, I thank you.
Ron and then Rosemary.
Ron Alvarado. I just want to speak to a little bit about the event and the complexity and the workload. So we're heavily engaged in providing technical assistance and financial assistance. We had to mobilize staff from across the state to help with the workload. So we had 2 signups in August, and we're 1st of August and then the latter part of August. It was so overwhelming for the field offices that we haven't even finished the second sign-up, addressing the second sign-up. So the first sign-up, there was over 50 applications for support. So I just want to say that it is a huge endeavor out there right now, and I can understand the need for additional support.
Rosemary, did you have a?
Rosemary Furphy for the record. I just want to go on record that the watershed councils that OWEB supports in Wasco County, particularly there's multi-party watersheds, but 15 Mile Creek and the area around Doofer that was impacted by the fires, they are tremendous community leaders in recovery of Mid-Columbia steelhead, innovation in water conservation. And so they are already leaders, and certainly anything we can do to support their efforts as they try to recover, it's very important. So they've shown to be tremendous conservationists, as well as the work they're doing on their agricultural land as well. So I want to put in a good word for them on Mid-Columbia steelhead recovery.
Will Newhouser, for the record, this may be more of a meta question, but on the comment about the burned area emergency response and the lack of a state program for that, is there a discussion about an equivalent, or where would that go?
For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, it's a great question, because as Laura mentioned, what has typically happened in the past is it has largely been federal or state land, forested land. We do have times, in last year down in this area, that it's popped down to private land. It may very well, and this was we teed up this conversation actually with you all last year. We had a request down at the Chetco Bar fire. And consistently over the years, folks have come to OWEB and said, hey, you have money, can you just fix post-fire, right? What's the total run, like 9 million? 8 million. So it would eat a chunk of our budget if they were just to come to us for the funding for restoration. And so actually what's been happening between the Chetco Bar fire and this request today is I think we may start to become that entity instead of spending the $9 million, or the $8 million. I'm going to just keep upping it, Ron. instead of spending the $8 million for the recovery, what we're doing is setting up a very small portion of OWEB funding, $60,000 in this case, $25,000 last year, was it, Eric? Where we can actually provide that support on pretty quick notice to help on the private lands and to partner up with the federal lands. And what we're hearing from the governor's office is OWEB is actually able to operate in a really unique spot, that if we're able to come to you all with these small requests, we can actually serve as that quick response instead of trying to go to the legislature and make that ask. So we had mentioned this last year on the Chetco Bar that we wanted to test it out there. We're testing again on this, but it may be something that we're coming to you more regularly for. And we feel like it's combined with the second request that Eric Williams is going to talk about, a really small request to get a really big bang on those private lands. So I think it may end up being us, at least for the short term.
Okay, move on to the next one.
Okay, for the record, Eric Williams, this is the second component of this request, and you can think of this as the contingency component of it. As Laura pointed out, this fire was different from many of the wildfires that we've encountered in that it did affect significant cropland, wheat growing area. And one of the immediate needs, in addition to the needs that Eric addressed in the technical assistance request, is to really make sure that actions happen quickly on the ground to prevent the spread of invasive grasses and plants. And I would just give tremendous kudos to Ron and NRCS for how quickly they have responded to this. There was a lot of work to do in terms of getting through the red tape for program waivers and things like that to make sure that funds were available quickly for landowners to access. And as Ron said, they were doing this in August. That was as soon as the fire was done, they were there. So this request relates to that in that the district is working with landowners to contract for herbicide applications on 24,000 acres of land, much of which will be done with aerial spray. NRCS will reimburse landowners for those costs. However, the concern that the district has is that based on how long it might take them from the start of their herbicide applications, which have already begun, to when they complete it, which is expected to be around the end of November, they have to go through a certification process to make sure the work was done properly, and then the reimbursement will come from NRCS. This $10,000 request is a contingency in case the district find themselves in a situation where they've got outstanding bills for the contractors that they hire to do this work, that they don't get reimbursement in time within that 30-day window to pay their contractors. They will take out a short-term loan from Craft 3. And that would, of course, entail interest, which is at a fairly low rate. And this request would be to cover any interest costs that the district would incur in making sure they can pay their contractors in a reasonable amount of time. If they can get through the process and get their reimbursements within a reasonable amount of time, they will not need to access these funds, and we would not expend them. The other piece I'll mention here, and it's in the staff report, is that, and this answers a question that was asked earlier, what happens if we request to go over the spending plan limitation? We come to you and ask you for an increase if recommended. And in this particular case, the request includes an increase in $10,000 to the governor's priority spending plan line item, and those funds would come from recaptured funds, which are from prior awarded grants that have not been spent and the projects have been closed out, or projects that have been completed under budget and funds remain. And so all of those funds are recaptured. Typically, they end up getting reprogrammed into the next biennium spending plan, but it does give us flexibility in situations like this to ask for an increase in a spending plan line item with those recaptured funds.
For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, a piece of context for you all, because it may seem really weird for us to be paying the interest on loan. I think the total amount on the sprain is like $467,000. The total, I can't remember what the number is.
$410,000.
$410,000. So basically what we're doing is for an up to $10,000 investment, making sure that that $410,000 can get onto the ground. We do have a precedent for this. Our acquisitions program allows us to pay interest on loans when a closing has to happen before OWEB money can become available. So we can, by statute, allow this, and Craft 3 has been the entity. They're a conservation lender of record and a really outstanding lender. So we do have a history of this when we are in that situation where what needs to be done on the ground, whether it's acquisition or in this case, emergent treatments that have to happen before the snow hits, that if for a very small investment, we can help get a big investment done, and the district just can't float up to $410,000 on their budget.
And Eric Williams, for the record, I would just add one small piece that this is, in effect, implementing an item in our strategic plan which talks about doing the job of coordinating funders so that people who are in need of the funding don't have to do all of that work. And Maida had made the contact initially with Craft 3 to link these two together, and things happened pretty quickly to get a deal in place.
Ron?
So, Ron Alvarado, so just to take you back a little further, the contract, the funding is in a landowner contract. We're not a granting agency. Our financial assistance is delivered through, in this case, EQIP contract. So once, and Eric's mentioned the certification process, once the work is certified, then we go out and we certify it, and then the landowner, we make the payment to the landowner, and then that's how it'll get reimbursed. So that's why the little gap between the time it's certified and then also just to, this is not new in terms of us responding to a post-fire event. We did this in the Canyon Fire when we did a coordinated aerial seeding in that case, in the district coordinated. It's just more cost-effective and efficient for someone like the district to work with the seed company and the other folks to do a group activity versus each landowner trying to contract with individual businesses. So this worked in the past, and just so you know that we have the money in contracts now, and yeah.
Any other questions or comments from the board? All right, we'll move to sense of the board on these two items. First, I'd like to see a show of hands for support or lack thereof for the board to delegate authority to the executive director to enter into grant agreements to implement technical assistance activities to identify and develop responses to immediate watershed health needs caused by the North Central Oregon fires on private lands in an amount not to exceed $60,000, to be taken from the governor's priority line items in the 2017-19 spending plan. All those showing support, please raise your hands. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Looks like everybody. And second, show of support for the board to add $10,000 of recaptured funds to the governor's priority line item of the 2017-19 spending plan, and delegate authority to the executive director to enter into a grant agreement with Wasco SWCD to cover fees, closing costs, and interest on a loan to implement post-fire restoration in an amount not to exceed $10,000 to be taken from the governor's priorities line item in the spending plan. Raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 again. Okay. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Erics.
Thank you.
Moving on to the final item in the book, but not the final item on the agenda.
Perfect. So we're going to move back to director's updates, item P, and the last one we have on that is number 5, programmatic effectiveness monitoring, telling the restoration story with Renee.
Great. Thanks, Jason. For the record, Renee Davis. So you guys heard a lot of mention of telling the story yesterday when we were talking about strategic plans, so I'll actually be able to update you now about that. So back at our board meeting, I think it's exactly 2 years ago down in Ashland, some of you remember Carl Wenner really pushing on us to say, why haven't we packaged up and told the story about all of the barrier removals that have happened on the main stem rogue? And so since that time and the aligning of the that suggestion or charge from a board member with the strategic plan conversations around, how can we better tell about the accomplishments associated with OWEB's investments, spurred Ken and Audrey and myself to really dig into what would it look like to tell the restoration story, what information do we have currently available to us. So we have spent some time working through with the monitoring subcommittee with staff from the grant program to really tee up a nice initial slate of retrospective restoration stories that are being put together right now. And as a reminder to the board, you all in French Glen allocated funding in support of these retrospective development pieces around the restoration story. So the intent is to take advantage of information that's out there currently about where there have been a number of investments in restoration by OWEB, but clearly partnering with other match and leveraged funding, and where we have existing data that could be used to begin to tease apart what have some of those effects on process and function in the system been. Not perfectly paired effectiveness monitoring per se, but really taking advantage of existing data and providing some resources to local partners to either analyze data that were previously collected but maybe haven't have been sitting around, not analyzed. In other cases, the data have been analyzed, but there hasn't been the opportunity to do some interpretation and compilation of that, and certainly not in a way that could also be more publicly accessible and telling that quantitative story. So these grants are intended to be up to $25,000 to provide resources for local partners to work with OWEB and put together those restoration stories. The idea is that there would be two products emerging from these. One would be more of a technical report, so not a 50-page document per se, but really making sure that we have documentation of what methods were used for data collection, analysis, what are some of those lessons learned from either the restoration or monitoring. So getting to Molly's point again about how are we kind of capturing some of those technical lessons, but then also the idea is to put together a more publicly accessible piece to tell the restoration story. Not necessarily something quite as slick as what you're seeing with the lottery campaign, given that these are grants for up to $25,000, but they could be fact sheets, they could be online infographics. A lot of the local partners are very interested in using story maps to present their information. So making sure that we have that paired piece of something that is kind of quick and understandable, but also having the technical foundation documented as part of that. So we worked, as I mentioned, with grant program and the monitoring subcommittee to really take a look at what opportunities might be out there. We looked across a range of geographies to make sure that we're getting some good spread around the state, given that different locations have very different systems, and it's nice to highlight a range of the work that's happening in different regions, but also looking at various restoration action types, so not focusing only on fish passage per se. So we currently have a slate of 7 restoration stories in development, about midway down the P5 Director's Update. You'll see the list of those. So we do have a fish passage restoration story for the Rogue that's in the queue now. We are working with the Umatilla tribes on telling the story of Meacham Creek, so a nice complement to the lottery video, and really focusing more on some of the quantitative results that we're seeing out of that. Work down in the Warner Lakes Basin, again focused on fish passage, but they're using some pretty innovative approaches to help with passage issues for sensitive species there. The Willanche Restoration Project that Molly mentioned, DEQ's involved in reviewing that over in the Coos Watershed. A lot of in-stream work that's been done in the West Fork Smith River, which some of you passed on your way down here. Some interesting floodplain enhancement work, some of stage 0 restoration work that's happening up in the Mackenzie on Deer Creek. And then finally, which we're pretty excited about, some pretty significant oak and wet prairie restoration in the upper Willamette, focused around the Coyote Creek area. So we've had incredible enthusiastic response from local partners when we've done that assessment of where has there been a slug of restoration, where do we have some existing data. When we've gone to folks and said, would you be interested in maybe partnering on this, they just hands down have said, we've been just waiting for an opportunity to do this, and having the resources that give them the chance to maybe pause and do the data analysis or do the data compilation, bring on some support for doing things like building story maps. They're just thrilled to have that opportunity. So thanks to the board for providing those resources. So what we're aiming for is to have this first slate of stories certainly done by summer of 2019, but our hope is that at least a few of them will be available by about February of next year, in hopes that we could feature those briefly during our budget presentation to the Natural Resources Subcommittee of Ways and Means. It's always nice to give them some real-world examples, and what better way than with something like a story map that a local partner has put together. And we will continue to work with grant program staff, with the monitoring subcommittee to scope opportunities for this. Certainly we have some grants in the queue right now that have done more of that paired restoration and effectiveness monitoring. Those will be great opportunities for future stories, but given the response that we've had on this, we do want to continue to scope beyond this initial 7. Are there some other places and some other restoration types that we've not yet highlighted that there might be some good opportunities around? So I'm saying that partly because there is the possibility that we may be working with the monitoring subcommittee to tee up another funding request in this vein, and then certainly as we look more towards taking advantage of that already funded effectiveness monitoring, potentially even supplementing some of those existing grants to ensure that we have not only the technical report, but more of the user-friendly restoration story, that we can begin to build a broader portfolio of those stories. So happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Renee? Alan?
Alan Henning. No question. I don't have a question for Renee. I just wanted to continue to express how much it does cost to tell the story on restoration successes, and how much it takes staff to veer off from what they typically do on a day-to-day basis to come back and collect thoughts, collect data, collect pictures, collect what it is that they need to tell a really good story. In DEQ's 319 program, there's a requirement that the state present success stories each year on where they've seen waters that were 303 delisted go off the list, get into the category of where they're meeting standards, and it takes a lot of money. We often use contractors in DC to help the state do that. $25,000 is really cheap. We've spent a lot more than that on doing those projects. So, and they're important projects. They're important to show our successes. And so the board's support in this venue in future years is really, really important. So.
One follow-on to that, just briefly for the record, Renee Davis. I mentioned that DEQ is helping to review the Willanch application. Both DEQ and ODFW have expressed a lot of excitement about the fact that we're doing this also, because in many cases, those agencies have provided technical assistance, at times paired with 319 funds. So we see a lot of opportunities to leverage this in terms of maybe telling a broader story too, that's beyond only OWEB, but could benefit DEQ in reporting on 319 and other agencies.
Any other questions or comments? All right, thanks, Renee.
Thanks.
Did I miss? Oh, Molly, do you have one? Real quick.
Just real quick, this is Molly Kyle. I just really, as a data wonk as well, so you kind of hit my soft spot here. This is so important, being able to evaluate both quantitatively as well as qualitatively the impact of projects in an agnostic manner to just see what does work, knowing that some won't work, but you learn as much from those as you do from the ones that do. It's such an important component of any project, and so I really do applaud the investment in this, and I look forward to seeing what the monitoring committee is doing and really trying to dig in into this piece. It's so important.
Thanks, Molly.
Thank you, Renee. And we're going to move to other business. We just have one item to bring up. I'd like to remind you that at the beginning, Maida pointed out that there's a letter from Craig Patterson in the blue folder, and the co-chairs and Maida reviewed that, and we feel like we should just craft a response directly. It addresses some policy decisions that already exist. If there's any input that you have right now about that, that we should know, if you've reviewed that, it'd be great to incorporate that, but otherwise just an informational point. Any feedback or comments right now? All right, thank you all very much. And
Just logistics.
final logistics for departing.
So, Derica, box lunches?
Yes, lunches are in the kitchen for board and staff. On the table, there are 2 varieties, and it says on a little paper plate in the middle what is on one side and what is on the other based on the color of the wrap. So, there are also, I think, drinks in the fridge, some sparkling water and regular water.
And then we will send you the logistics information for the November 7th and 8th FIP interviews for a reminder on your calendar, and we'll send out more details to, if you can, hold February 22nd for the celebration at the Capitol. And I think I had a couple folks who had requested copies of the Who We Are, kind of the small version of the strategic plan. If that's of interest to you, just pop an email over to Derica, and we can print copies on our nice printer and ship them out to you. Just let us know how many, and we're more than happy to do that.
And then, depending on your preference, you can take your name tag and either reattach it to your name plate or take it with you and bring it back at the next meeting.